Here is the question I've never been able to answer cleanly. If you watch something terrible happen to a person and you feel the wrong thing, does that make you responsible for what you feel, or only for what you do with it? I've been sitting with that question for 3 years. I don't have a clean answer. What I have instead is this account, which I'm giving as honestly as I can manage. And the honest version requires me to tell you things about myself that I would prefer not to tell you. That's the point of honesty. It costs you something, or it isn't honesty. My name is Stuart. I'm 46 years old. I live alone in a sandstone flat on the south side of Glasgow. 2 bedrooms, high ceilings, the kind of place that was built for a family and has gradually become an extension of a single person's interior life. Books stacked on every surface, a kitchen used seriously and well, a second bedroom that functions as a study and which nobody else has entered in about 2 years. I work as a structural engineer for a consultancy in the city centre. I am good at my job in the quiet, unremarkable way that people who have done something for 20 years without drama are good at it. Thorough, reliable, not brilliant, but not far off. I run 3 times a week. I cook from scratch most evenings. I have 2 close friends, both from university, both with families now, both of whom I see less than I'd like and more than I deserve. I should tell you about my father, not because what happened is his fault. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because there is a version of this story that uses him as an explanation, and I don't believe in that version. But he is relevant context, so I'll give him to you plainly. He was a man who contained, for as long as I knew him, a reservoir of anger that had no consistent relationship to events. It surfaced unpredictably, with a violence that was controlled enough to avoid leaving marks anyone outside the house would notice. And it receded just as unpredictably, replaced by a version of him that was warm and funny and genuinely good company. I grew up understanding that there were 2 registers available to a man under pressure. I grew up understanding which one I preferred not to become. I have spent the better part of my adult life managing that inheritance, recognizing the anger when it appears, which is not as often as I feared when I was young, and containing it, directing it into the run, the controlled effort of physical exertion, the clean problem-solving of structural engineering where the forces are calculable and the tolerances are known. I am not my father. I know that, but I also know that I am not as far from him as I'd like, and the distance requires maintenance. And there have been periods of my life when the maintenance has felt effortful in ways I haven't admitted to anyone. I was in one of those periods when I found the site. The divorce had been finalized 8 months earlier. I don't want to dwell on it, partly because it isn't the point, and partly because the reasons for it reflect poorly enough on me that the relevant facts can be stated briefly. Karen and I were together for 11 years and married for 7. We didn't have children, which was a source of grief for her, and an ambivalence I handled badly by avoiding the conversation for too long. The marriage ended because I was emotionally unavailable in ways I understood too late, and because the unavailability had, over years, produced in Karen a loneliness she'd finally decided she didn't have to sustain. She was right about all of it. The anger I felt about the divorce was directed, accurately, inward, which is the healthiest direction for it, and also the most corrosive over time. I was managing. That's the word I keep using for the periods in my life when I'm functioning without flourishing, and it applied here. Work was fine. The runs were longer than usual. I was cooking elaborate meals for one and reading a great deal and seeing my friends occasionally. And by any external measure, I was fine. I was getting through it. I was doing what people do when a significant part of their life ends and they have to reorganize around the space it leaves. The site appeared in my life the way these things apparently always do, through a chain of connections that each seemed innocuous and which I've retraced many times since without finding the individual link that should have stopped me. A forum I used for engineering discussion had a thread about digital privacy that referenced a broader conversation happening elsewhere. That conversation was happening on a platform I hadn't used before, and the platform had, among its many channels, a section given over to discussions of online content that existed at the edges of legality. I read that section the way you read things you've stumbled into, with the half attention of someone who expects to find nothing and is half hoping to be proved right. I wasn't proved right. The references in that section to a specific category of site were oblique enough that I had to piece together what was being described from context and implication rather than explicit statement. When I understood what was being described, I closed the application and made dinner and ran 8 miles the following morning and told myself I was done with it. I went back 4 days later. I want to stop here because what comes next requires me to be honest about something I have not been fully honest about, even with myself, until I sat down to write this. When I went back, it wasn't purely out of morbid curiosity. That's the comfortable version, and it has the advantage of being partially true, but it isn't the whole truth. The whole truth is that in the weeks after the divorce was finalized, in the period of managed functioning and long runs and elaborate solitary meals, I'd become aware of something in myself, that the maintenance I mentioned earlier was doing less to contain than usual. A pressure without a specific object, an anger that had turned during those months slightly abstract, no longer directed at myself for the failure of the marriage, not directed at Karen, not directed at any identifiable thing, just present, a low-level force looking for somewhere to resolve. I had recognized this before. I recognized it then, and I went back to that section of the platform with a quality of attention that I am not proud of, looking for something I cannot name cleanly even now, some way of sitting with the force without having to account for it. What I found navigating through the chain of references over several sessions was a site. I won't describe its technical specifics. What I will describe is its content, because the content is the point. It was a repository of streams, live and recorded. The streams showed people being harmed. The harm was deliberate, methodical, administered by parties who remained off camera, and the people receiving it were restrained and unable to prevent it, and clearly, undeniably real. The streams were categorized, rated, discussed in an attached forum with the engaged interest of people who had been watching for a long time and had developed strong opinions about quality and craft and the specific elements that elevated one stream above another. I watched part of one stream. I am going to tell you what I felt, because this is the part of the account that matters most, and because honesty requires it. I felt sick. That part was immediate and genuine, and has never left me. The physical reality of what I was watching. A person in a room, hurt, unable to stop what was being done to them, produced a nausea that was visceral and absolute. I want you to know that was real, but underneath it, or alongside it, in a register I had to work to acknowledge and have spent 3 years working to understand, there was something else, not pleasure. I want to be precise here because imprecision would be a kind of self-exculpation I don't deserve. It wasn't pleasure, but it was recognition, a sense, horrible and clarifying, of looking at a structure that corresponded to something I already contained. Not the specific acts, not the desire to commit them, but the force behind them, the pressure finding its outlet, the anger resolved into action. I recognized the energy of it even as the content revolted me. And the recognition was worse than the revulsion, because it was mine. It came from inside. It told me something about the distance between myself and my father that I had spent 20 years trying not to measure too carefully. I closed the stream. I sat in my study for a long time. 3 days passed. I ran every morning. I went to work and did my job and spoke to colleagues with normal fluency. I rang my friend Mark in Edinburgh and we talked about his kids and about a project I was working on. And I was present and engaged and entirely myself, which is the terrifying thing about this period in retrospect. How completely compartmentalized it was, how the ordinary life continued without interruption, while the other thing sat in its separate container and waited. On the 4th day, I went back to the site, not to watch. I want to be specific about that because specificity is what I owe this account. I went back to read the forum, to understand who was there, what they were, what the community that had organized around this content actually consisted of. I told myself it was a need to understand rather than participate, which was partly true. The other part, I'll leave you to assess. What I found in the forum was not what I'd expected, and what I'd expected was bad enough. I'd expected a community of people who were comprehensively unlike me, people I could locate clearly on the other side of a line I was confident I stood on the correct side of. What I found instead was a range. There were people who were comprehensively unlike me, yes. People for whom the content was clearly the organizing principle of their lives, whose posts had the fluency of long practice, who referenced streams and categories and specific performers with the ease of people in a specialist hobby discussing technique. But there were also people who sounded, in their register and their self-presentation, and the particular quality of their engagement, uncomfortably like someone sitting in a sandstone flat in Glasgow, with high ceilings and a second bedroom used as a study. People who framed their presence as curiosity, who used the language of detachment and observation, who had clearly told themselves a version of the same story I'd been telling myself for 4 days, about watching rather than participating, about understanding rather than consuming. The forum had a thread dedicated to new members. The thread contained, among other things, a discussion of what the moderators called the curiosity pipeline, a term they used without irony to describe the predictable path by which new members arrived, the stages of engagement they moved through, the point at which passive observation became active participation. The thread described this process with the satisfied expertise of people who had watched it happen many times and knew exactly how it worked, and were entirely unbothered by it. New members always started as observers. New members always told themselves they were different. The forum had been watching new members move through these stages for years. I read that thread at 11 o'clock on a Thursday evening, and then I sat in my study and I looked at myself very clearly for the first time in 4 days. What I saw was not comfortable. I saw a man who had gone back twice, who had watched part of a stream and felt something he didn't want to name and gone back anyway, and then again, and who was now reading a forum's clinical description of his own behavior as a known and predictable pattern, a pipeline, a process they had watched repeat itself in person after person until it had become so familiar it could be discussed as a category rather than an individual failing. I saw the distance from my father, and I saw that it was measurable, and I did not like the measurement. I rang the police the following morning, not the emergency line, the non-emergency number, and then I was transferred twice, and eventually I spoke to someone from a unit that dealt specifically with online serious harm, a man who was professional and thorough and who asked me to walk him through everything I'd seen and where I'd seen it without asking me, at any point, to characterize what my own engagement with it had been. I gave him the site, the forum, the stream I'd watched, the chain of platforms that had led me there. I answered his questions for 40 minutes. He told me the site was known to them and that the information I'd provided was useful. He told me what the process would be from that point. He did not tell me what would happen to the people in those streams, and I didn't ask, because I already knew the honest answer was that it depended, that these investigations were long and complex, and the outcomes were uncertain, and I needed to make the call regardless of what the outcome was going to be. I've been in therapy since the following month, not because I was required to be, not as part of any formal process, but because the accounting I'd done in my study on that Thursday evening made it clear that the maintenance I'd been relying on for 20 years was not adequate, and had perhaps never been adequate, and that I needed to understand myself better than I did. The therapy has been difficult and useful in the way that difficult things are useful. I've talked about my father more in the past 3 years than in the preceding 43. I've talked about the anger and what it is and where it comes from and what it is not. It is not a desire to harm. The therapist and I have been through this carefully, but it is a force that requires honest acknowledgement rather than management through suppression and misdirection, which is what I had been doing. The question I started with, about watching and feeling the wrong thing and responsibility, my therapist and I have discussed it in many different ways over 3 years and arrived somewhere that isn't a clean answer, but is perhaps as close as I'm going to get. Feeling is not doing. The recognition I felt watching that stream does not make me the same as the person off camera, but it is information, and information requires a response. And the response I chose, the call, the therapy, the long, honest work of understanding what I contain and why, is the only thing I have that stands between the question and an answer I couldn't live with. I still live in the flat. The ceilings are still high. I still run 3 times a week and cook from scratch and see Mark in Edinburgh when I can manage it. I am not my father. I believe that more confidently now than I did 3 years ago, which is perhaps the only straightforward improvement I can point to. The site was still operational the last time I thought to wonder about it, which is less often than it used to be. The people in those streams are people I cannot locate or help or reach in any direction from a sandstone flat in Glasgow. And that helplessness is something I've had to make a kind of peace with, because the alternative is to let it become another thing the anger attaches to. And I am trying, carefully, and with a great deal of assistance, to give the anger fewer places to live. It is slow work. It is the right work. Most days I believe that. The runs are shorter now than they were 3 years ago. Not because I need them less, but because I've found other ways to use the pressure, other places to put it that don't require me to exhaust myself into calm. That feels like progress. Small, undramatic, the kind of progress that doesn't look like much from the outside. Do you have one of those repair people you trust? A plumber or electrician whose number you keep saved because they've done good work before and you know they'll turn up when they say they will? I had someone like that, a handyman called Steve who'd fixed various things around my house over the past few years. A leaking tap, some dodgy wiring, a bathroom fan that had stopped working. Reliable, reasonably priced, the sort of person you're grateful to have found in a world where tradespeople are often impossible to pin down. I gave him a key to my house once, just for convenience, whilst he worked on a job when I couldn't be there. That single decision is why I now know my kitchen looks different at 3 in the morning than it does during the day. Why I've seen footage of my bedroom that I definitely didn't record, and why my home address appears on a website that charges people for live access to spaces they have no right to see. I'm a physiotherapist working at a clinic in Sheffield. Been there for about 7 years. I live in a semi-detached house in one of the suburbs, the kind of area where people know their neighbours vaguely, but mostly keep to themselves. It's a decent house, nothing fancy, but it's mine, and I've worked hard to afford it. I live alone, which I've always preferred. The freedom to keep my own schedule, the peace and quiet after dealing with patients all day. Steve first did some work for me about 3 years ago. I'd found him through a recommendation from a colleague whose bathroom he'd renovated. He'd come round to fix a persistent leak under my kitchen sink that I'd been ignoring for too long. He was punctual, polite, did the job efficiently, and charged a fair price. Over the following years, I called him back for various other bits and pieces, replacing light fixtures, fixing a loose banister, installing some shelving in the spare room. Last autumn, I needed some electrical work done in the hallway. A ceiling light had started flickering worryingly, and I wanted it sorted properly rather than just replacing the bulb and hoping for the best. Steve came round to assess the job and said it would take most of an afternoon. The problem was I had several patient appointments scheduled that day and couldn't take time off. Steve suggested I could leave him a key, and he let himself in and out, locking up properly when he finished. He'd done this for other clients before, he said, and it made things easier than trying to coordinate schedules. I hesitated slightly. It's never comfortable giving someone access to your home when you're not there. But I'd known Steve for years at this point, and he'd never given me any reason to doubt his professionalism. I agreed, and left a spare key under the back doormat with instructions about which light was the problem. The work was done exactly as promised. When I got home that evening, the light was fixed, the key was back under the mat, and everything seemed perfectly normal. Steve sent a text to confirm he'd finished, and I transferred the payment that evening. Simple, professional, exactly the kind of smooth transaction that makes you feel you've made the right choice in tradespeople. About 2 weeks later, I started noticing things that seemed slightly off. Nothing major, just small details that didn't quite match how I remembered leaving them. A kitchen cupboard door that I was sure I'd closed was standing open. The living room curtains were pulled slightly wider apart than I usually positioned them. A throw cushion on the sofa had moved from one end to the other. I put it down to tiredness and distraction. I'd been working long hours covering for a colleague on sick leave, and it's easy to forget small actions when your mind is occupied with other things. Everyone has moments where they can't quite remember whether they've done something or just intended to. But the occurrences continued. More cupboards left open. Lights turned on in rooms I was certain I'd left dark. My bedroom door standing ajar when I always closed it fully. The bathroom bin moved from its usual spot by the sink to underneath the window. Each incident was minor enough to dismiss individually, but together they formed a pattern that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Then I noticed something more concrete. I have a small jewelry box on my bedroom dresser, just costume pieces mostly, nothing valuable. The box has a particular way I arrange it. Necklaces on one side, earrings on the other, a few rings in a little compartment at the back. One morning, I found everything mixed together, the necklaces tangled with the earrings, the rings scattered throughout. I hadn't touched that box in over a week. That's when I started to suspect someone had been entering my house. Not to steal, nothing was missing as far as I could tell, but simply to be there, to move through the space and disturb things in small ways that made their presence known. It felt deliberate, like someone wanted me to realize my home wasn't as private as I believed. I checked all the doors and windows, looking for signs of forced entry. Everything was secure and undamaged. The locks showed no evidence of tampering. There was no obvious explanation for how someone could be getting in, unless they had a key. And the only person outside my immediate family who'd ever had access to my key was Steve. I tried to dismiss the thought. Steve was a professional tradesman with plenty of work, no reason to risk his reputation and livelihood by sneaking into clients' homes. But the timing fit. The disturbances had started after he'd used my key to do that electrical work, and he'd had ample opportunity to copy the key before returning it. I changed my locks anyway, just to be safe. It cost more than I'd hoped, but I needed to feel secure in my own home. For about a week afterwards, everything seemed normal. No more mysterious disturbances, no more items moved or lights left on. I felt relieved, convinced that changing the locks had solved whatever problem had existed, even if I never fully understood what it had been. Then one morning I found a mug in my kitchen sink that I didn't recognize. Not one of mine, just a plain white mug, but definitely not from my cupboards. It was sitting in the sink, like someone had used it for tea or coffee and left it there to wash later. The casual domesticity of it made my skin crawl. Someone had been in my house, made themselves a drink, used a mug they'd brought with them, and left it behind deliberately. I called the police immediately. They came and took the mug for fingerprints, took a statement about the incidents I'd been experiencing, checked the house for any signs of how someone might be entering. They found nothing conclusive. The mug had been wiped clean. There were no marks on doors or windows, no sign of how access was being gained. The officer who responded suggested I install cameras inside the house, not just external security, but something that would capture anyone moving around inside. I did that the same day, setting up several small cameras in the hallway, kitchen, and living room, all connected to my phone so I'd receive alerts if they detected movement while I was out. For 3 days, the cameras showed nothing unusual. Just me leaving in the morning and returning in the evening, the house empty and undisturbed in between. I started to think maybe the mug had been enough. Maybe whoever was doing this had realized they'd been too obvious and had stopped. Then on the 4th day, I received a movement alert around 2 in the afternoon. I was with a patient at the time and couldn't check immediately, but as soon as I had a break, I pulled up the camera feed on my phone. The footage showed a figure moving through my house, walking casually from room to room as though they had every right to be there. It was Steve. I recognized him immediately despite the cap he was wearing. He moved through my kitchen, opened cupboards and peered inside, stood looking out of the living room window for a few minutes. He went upstairs beyond the range of my cameras and stayed there for about 20 minutes before coming back down and leaving through the front door. The whole visit lasted around 40 minutes. I felt sick watching it. This was someone I'd trusted, someone I'd paid for honest work, someone I'd given access to my home because I thought he was reliable and professional. And he'd been entering my house regularly, walking through my private spaces, doing God knows what whilst I was at work, and completely unaware. I saved the footage and took it straight to the police station when I finished work that evening. This time, they had clear evidence of a crime, an identifiable suspect. They visited Steve that evening and arrested him. When they searched his van, they found keys to around 30 different properties, all carefully labeled with addresses. My key was among them, freshly cut to match my new locks. He'd somehow obtained details of my new lock type and had a key made before I'd even realized the locks had been changed. But what they found at his house was worse. He had hard drives containing thousands of hours of video footage from inside people's homes. Not just footage of him walking through empty houses. but recordings from cameras he'd installed secretly during legitimate repair visits. Tiny cameras hidden in smoke detectors, air vents, light fixtures. Devices he'd placed while supposedly fixing problems, whilst homeowners trusted him to work unsupervised in their properties. The footage went back years, hundreds of homes across Sheffield and surrounding areas, all of them belonging to people who'd hired him for basic maintenance work and unknowingly given him opportunities to install surveillance equipment. The videos showed everything: people going about their daily lives, private moments they thought were completely unwitnessed, intimate details of how they lived when they believed they were alone. During questioning, Steve admitted he'd been selling access to these camera feeds on the dark web. He'd created accounts for each property, organized by location and type of residence, and charged subscription fees for people to watch live feeds from inside strangers' homes. Some buyers wanted to watch specific types of households. Others just wanted the voyeuristic thrill of observing people who had no idea they were being watched. A detective showed me the website where my home had been listed. It was organized like a streaming service, with thumbnail previews of different properties and descriptions of what viewers could expect to see. My house was categorized under single-occupant female residences, with notes about my work schedule and typical routine. The listing boasted about multiple camera angles and high video quality. The subscription data showed my feed had been purchased by around 40 different people over the months since Steve had installed the cameras. 40 strangers had been watching me move around my own home, had observed my private routines, had seen everything I did whilst thinking I was completely alone and unobserved. The thought of it made me feel violated in a way that was difficult to articulate. The detective explained that the cameras Steve had installed were sophisticated enough to be nearly impossible to find without knowing exactly what to look for. They were powered by the home's electrical system, so they didn't require battery changes. They used the home's internet connection to stream footage, but did so in ways that wouldn't show up obviously en route to traffic. Unless you were specifically looking for hidden surveillance equipment with professional detection tools, you'd never know they were there. It took a team of specialists most of a day to find and remove all the cameras from my house. There were 5 in total, 1 in a hallway smoke detector, 1 in a kitchen air vent, 1 in the living room lamp fixture, 1 in the bathroom extractor fan, and 1 in my bedroom ceiling light. 5 devices that had been watching me for months, recording everything, streaming it to paying subscribers who viewed my private life as entertainment. Steve was prosecuted and received a prison sentence, though it seemed inadequate given the scale of what he'd done and the number of people he'd violated. The investigation identified over 80 homes where he'd installed surveillance equipment, though they suspected there were more they never found. Many of his victims never knew what had happened because he'd removed the cameras himself after subscription interest waned or before homeowners planned renovations that might uncover them. The website where the footage was sold was shut down, but police confirmed the videos had been downloaded by subscribers before they could seize the servers. Months of footage from my home existed in private collections, potentially being reshared through other platforms or simply kept for personal viewing. There was no way to recover or delete all of it. It was out there permanently, beyond any control or remedy. I sold that house within 4 months of discovering the cameras. I couldn't live somewhere that had been so thoroughly surveilled, where strangers had watched me sleep and shower and exist in moments I'd believed were completely private. Every room felt contaminated by the knowledge of what had happened there, what had been recorded and sold and viewed by people whose names I'd never know. My new house was built recently enough that it doesn't need much maintenance, which is fortunate because I'll never hire another tradesperson to work unsupervised in my home. I've learned to do basic repairs myself, and for anything beyond my capabilities, I take time off work to be present whilst the work is done. I visually inspect every smoke detector, every vent, every light fixture regularly, checking for anything that seems out of place. But I know the footage still exists somewhere. Months of my life recorded without my knowledge or consent, available to people who paid for the privilege of watching a stranger in her own home. Every private moment I had during that period is potentially being viewed by someone right now, shared in spaces I'll never access, discussed by people I'll never identify. What disturbs me most is thinking about how many other people are living in homes with hidden cameras they don't know about. How many tradespeople are operating similar schemes right now, installing surveillance equipment during legitimate repair visits, selling access to private lives through dark web marketplaces. Steve was caught because I noticed he'd entered my house and installed obvious security cameras. But if I'd never noticed the initial intrusions, if I'd never installed those cameras, he'd still be operating. The surveillance would have continued indefinitely, and I'd never have known my home wasn't actually private. I gave a tradesperson a key once, a simple convenience to avoid scheduling conflicts, done with someone I trusted based on years of apparently professional service. That decision led to months of secret surveillance, my private life sold to strangers as entertainment, permanent footage existing in collections I'll never locate or control. That's what I think about now when I see repair vans in residential areas. Not whether the tradesperson is qualified or professional, but whether they're installing more than they're fixing, whether they're creating opportunities for surveillance whilst homeowners trust them to work alone, whether the homes they visited are being watched right now by paying subscribers who view private lives as commodities worth purchasing access to. I used to work in digital forensics. Not the glamorous kind you see on TV shows where they instantly break encryptions and enhance grainy photos into crystal clarity. My job involved the painstaking process of recovering deleted files, tracing digital footprints, and documenting evidence for court cases. Most of my career was spent helping corporate clients recover from data breaches, or assisting in divorce cases where one spouse suspected the other of hiding assets. Mundane stuff, really, until the Harmon case. Detective Harmon approached our firm after their department's tech specialist hit a wall. A college student had gone missing under suspicious circumstances, and they'd recovered the victim's laptop. The browser history had been meticulously scrubbed, but fragments remained in the cache, suggesting visits to Tor-enabled sites. The department needed someone with expertise in recovering digital breadcrumbs that existed beyond the reach of standard investigation techniques. That's where I came in. I'm not going to pretend I was unfamiliar with the dark web. Anyone who works in my field understands its architecture, even if they've never ventured there themselves. I knew about the marketplaces for illegal goods, the forums for exchanging information that wouldn't be welcome on the surface web, and the encrypted communication channels. But I also knew most of the horror stories people shared about the dark web were urban legends. Hidden servers streaming murders live for Bitcoin. Red rooms where viewers could direct torture. Those were digital campfire stories meant to scare the uninitiated. At least, that's what I believed at the time. Working from an isolated system in our lab, I began the process of reconstructing the student's digital trail. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect from a 20-year-old. Social media, streaming services, online gaming platforms, and academic research. But interspersed throughout were these brief sessions using the Tor browser, always late at night, always from the same location based on the network logs. The pattern suggested a ritual of sorts, something done in private, perhaps even secretively. After 3 days of careful analysis, I managed to recover fragments of an encryption key stored in a text file disguised as system data. The key itself was incomplete, but it gave me something to work with. I traced its digital fingerprint through the remnants of the browser cache and discovered what appeared to be a login credential for an Onion site. That's when my professional curiosity began to override my better judgment. I should have simply documented my findings and handed everything over to Detective Harmon. That would have been the proper protocol. Instead, I decided to follow the trail myself, just a little further. I told myself it was to ensure I was providing the police with actionable intelligence. In reality, I wanted to know what this student had found. What had drawn them into those late-night sessions? What might connect to their disappearance? I set up a secure, isolated machine specifically for this purpose. Multiple VPNs, traffic routing through several countries, disconnected from any of our firm's systems. Every precaution possible. The address recovered from the student's computer led to what appeared to be a forum, but access required both the encryption key I'd found and another credential I didn't have. A dead end, or so it seemed. Further analysis of the recovered data revealed communication with another user, someone who had apparently provided guidance on accessing certain areas of the dark web. I managed to find fragments of these conversations, not enough to identify the other party, but enough to piece together instructions for generating the second credential needed for the forum. It took another day of work, but eventually I had what I needed. I accessed the forum on my isolated machine. What I found wasn't immediately alarming. Discussions about privacy, cryptocurrency, philosophy. Nothing illegal on its face. But there was a section accessible only to users with a certain status. The missing student had apparently reached that status shortly before their disappearance. I couldn't access this restricted area, but I could see references to it in other conversations. Users spoke about observations and sessions in terminology that seemed deliberately vague. They discussed payment methods and scheduling. One thread mentioned preference settings and interaction parameters. All of it couched in ambiguous language that could have meant anything from watching academic lectures to something far more sinister. 2 weeks into my investigation, I received an unexpected message on the forum from a user named Artemis Prime. They wanted to know if I was interested in gaining access to the restricted section. The timing was suspicious. I hadn't been active enough on the forum to naturally attract this kind of attention. Either the forum had sophisticated security that had identified me as an outsider, or someone had been monitoring the recovery attempts on the student's computer and traced them back to me. Neither possibility was comforting. I created a plausible cover story and expressed interest. Artemis Prime explained that the restricted section hosted special live streams for members who had proven both their discretion and their financial commitment. The price for access was substantial, $5,000 in cryptocurrency. When I asked what kind of content these live streams contained, the answer was vague but unsettling. They offered interactive observation experiences that couldn't be found anywhere else. Viewers could influence outcomes in real time. I reported all of this to Detective Harmon, who brought in federal authorities. They advised me to maintain communication with Artemis Prime while they attempted to trace the user's location. For 3 days, I continued the conversation, expressing interest, but asking for more details before committing the money. Artemis Prime eventually offered me a free preview session scheduled for midnight the following day. Against the advice of the federal agents, I agreed to observe the preview. Their concern was that viewing any content might constitute criminal activity on my part, depending on what was shown. My argument was that we needed to know exactly what we were dealing with, and that, as a forensic investigator, I had viewed illegal content before when it was necessary for an investigation. Eventually, they relented, on the condition that I would terminate the connection immediately if the content clearly involved illegal activity. The night of the preview session, I sat in a secured room at the federal building, surrounded by agents specializing in cybercrime. My isolated laptop was connected to a larger monitor, so everyone could see what I was seeing, but the connection itself remained solely through my machine. At precisely midnight, I received a link from Artemis Prime, valid for 5 minutes only. The link led to a streaming page with minimalist design. Black background, a video player in the center, a small chat window to the right, a countdown timer showing 15 minutes. The video showed an empty room with white walls, a single chair in the center, nothing else. The chat window showed about 24 usernames, none recognizable. Most were strings of numbers and letters. No one was typing. 3 minutes into the stream, the door to the room opened. A figure entered, wearing a black hood that obscured their face completely. They carried a small digital tablet. The person sat in the chair, holding the tablet facing the camera. On the screen was today's date and time, along with a random string of characters that had been generated in the chat window seconds earlier. This was proof that the stream was live, not pre-recorded. The hooded figure set the tablet aside and pulled out a small card, which they held up to the camera. On it was written my username on the forum, along with the words, "Welcome to your preview." The federal agents exchanged concerned glances. This was meant specifically for me. The observers were being observed. For the next 10 minutes, nothing happened. The hooded figure simply sat there, occasionally checking the tablet. The chat remained inactive. Then, just as the countdown timer reached 1 minute remaining, the figure held up the tablet again. On it was a message addressed to me by my real name. Not my username, but my actual name. It listed my home address, the name of my firm, and the names of my family members. It ended with a simple statement. The preview isn't what we're showing you. It's who we're showing you to. The federal agents immediately terminated the connection and moved me and my family to a secure location. The investigation shifted from finding the missing student to identifying who was behind the stream and how they had obtained my personal information. Background checks were run on everyone at my firm, everyone involved in the investigation. Digital security experts examined every device I owned for breaches. A week into protective custody, we received the news. The missing student had been found alive. They had apparently gone off-grid voluntarily after being spooked by something they'd witnessed on the forum. When questioned about the restricted section and the live streams, they became agitated and refused to provide details. All they would say was that the streams weren't what people thought, that the real purpose was something else entirely. The federal investigation identified several members of the forum, including Artemis Prime, though no arrests were made. The official conclusion was that the forum was running an elaborate scam, charging significant amounts of money for staged extreme content that created the illusion of red rooms without actually committing violent crimes. The personal information they had about me had been gathered through social engineering and basic doxing techniques. The case was closed. The missing student was no longer missing. No laws had technically been broken. Life could go back to normal. Except it doesn't work that way. Not really. 2 months after returning home, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single photograph showing the interior of my bedroom taken from the perspective of the computer webcam. The metadata embedded in the image indicated it had been taken 3 days earlier at 2:17 a.m. I had been asleep in the bed visible in the frame. I immediately checked my computer for malware, replaced the webcam with one that had a physical cover, and installed additional security systems in my home. I didn't tell my family or the authorities about the photograph. There didn't seem to be a point. What could they do that hadn't already been done? A week later, another envelope arrived. This one contained a USB drive. Against all better judgment and professional protocols, I connected it to an isolated machine. It contained a single video file. The thumbnail showed the white room from the live stream. I didn't play it. I destroyed the drive and reinforced all of my digital security measures. The envelope stopped coming after that, but other things started happening. Small disturbances in my daily routine. Items in my home slightly moved from where I'd left them. The sense of being watched during my commute to work. A glimpse of a hooded figure in a passing crowd. Nothing concrete enough to report. Nothing I could prove wasn't my imagination working overtime. I started noticing patterns in the timing of these disturbances. They always happened on days when I'd used the internet for anything more sensitive than checking the weather. Online banking, emails containing personal information, searching for information related to security systems. Any of these would be followed by some small sign that I was being observed. 6 months after the investigation, I attended a cybersecurity conference in my professional capacity. During a panel discussion on privacy threats, one of the speakers made eye contact with me in the audience. I had never met them before, but something in their expression suggested recognition. After the panel, they approached me directly, leaned close, and whispered in my ear. No introduction, no preamble, just 5 words. They never stopped watching you. The speaker disappeared into the crowd before I could respond or ask questions. I left the conference immediately and spent the night systematically checking every device I owned, every account, every possible digital vulnerability. I found nothing unusual. Everything appeared secure. But that night, I woke at exactly 2:17 a.m. to the distinct feeling of being observed. The room was empty. The webcam light was off. All was still. Yet the sensation persisted. I've since learned that what we discovered wasn't a red room in the traditional sense. It wasn't about watching violence or exploitation. It was something potentially more disturbing. A network dedicated to the comprehensive observation of specific individuals. The interactive element wasn't about directing harm, but rather about collectively monitoring, studying, and subtly interfering with the lives of targeted subjects. The missing student hadn't been a victim in the way we initially feared, but rather someone who had discovered the network and then been absorbed into it, becoming an observer rather than the observed. I've changed jobs since then, moved across the country, adopted rigorous privacy practices both online and offline. I use only cash when possible, avoid social media entirely, and regularly sweep my living spaces for surveillance devices. Most would call it paranoia. Perhaps it is, but I can't shake the certainty that I'm still being watched, that my every movement is being logged, analyzed, and shared among unseen observers who paid for the privilege of witnessing my slow psychological unraveling. The most unsettling realization came just last week. I was reviewing some old files from the investigation and noticed something I had missed initially. The timing of the students' late-night tour sessions perfectly matched periods when their webcam had been active, though no video chat applications had been running. They hadn't been watching something on those nights. They had been allowing themselves to be watched. Sometimes now, in moments of desperation or exhaustion, I find myself staring directly into my covered webcam, and speaking to whoever might be on the other side. No response ever comes, but occasionally, within minutes of these one-sided conversations, my phone will receive a text message from an unknown number. The messages never contain words, just a timestamp, 2:17. I don't know how many others are out there, targets of this invisible audience. I don't know what they want or what purpose this elaborate system of observation serves. But I've come to understand one thing with absolute certainty. The most terrifying predators aren't those who want to harm you physically. They're the ones content to simply watch as the knowledge of their watching slowly destroys your sense of security, privacy, and ultimately your sanity. If you're reading this, I have one piece of advice. The next time you feel that inexplicable sensation of being watched when you're alone, don't dismiss it as imagination. Don't look around the empty rooms searching for hidden cameras. Instead, look directly into the devices you've willingly placed in your most private spaces. Wave hello. They've probably been watching you for quite some time now. Imagine if the biggest mistake in your life came from being curious about something you saw in a film. That's what happened to my nephew, Tom, and it's why I can't sleep properly anymore. He was 16, the kind of kid who spent his weekends helping his gran with her garden and riding his bike down to the harbour to watch the fishing boats come in. Not the sort you'd expect to get mixed up in something dark. But that's the thing about curiosity. It doesn't discriminate. It started last autumn when he watched some thriller at the cinema in Truro about people being kidnapped and forced to perform for online audiences. The film made it seem like these things actually happened, that there were websites hidden beneath the normal internet where people paid to watch terrible things in real time. Most adults would have dismissed it as Hollywood nonsense. But 16-year-olds don't have that filter yet. Tom lived with his mum in Polperro, one of those picture postcard Cornish villages where everyone knows everyone, and the most exciting thing that usually happens is a tourist getting stuck in the narrow streets with a rental car. His dad had left when he was small, so it was just the two of them in a cottage overlooking the harbour. She worked at the local primary school and trusted him to be sensible while she was out. The trouble began when he started researching whether the film's premise was real. He found a Reddit thread discussing the movie, where users debated its authenticity. Most dismissed it as fiction, but a few claimed to know otherwise. One user posted a cryptic comment: "The rabbit hole goes deeper than Hollywood thinks. PM me if you're actually curious." Tom's curiosity got the better of him. He messaged the user, who responded with a YouTube link disguised as a tutorial for advanced internet privacy. The video seemed innocent enough. A bearded man in a basement explaining VPNs and encryption. But buried in the comments section were breadcrumbs, references to Tor, specific forum names, and invitation codes. It took him several weeks to work out how to access these hidden networks. The learning curve was steep, but he persisted, documenting his progress in a private Discord server he'd created. Looking back, that was his first mistake, creating a digital trail of his journey into the shadows. When he finally managed to connect, he spent hours exploring, fascinated by this parallel internet. Most of what he found was disappointing. Defunct forums, conspiracy sites, and pages that looked like they'd been abandoned for years. But he kept searching, following links and recommendations, going deeper into increasingly obscure corners. The breakthrough came when he found a forum dedicated to discussing the very type of content he'd seen in the film. Users shared links and recommendations with clinical detachment, discussing authenticity like film critics. Reading through the posts, he realized that what he thought was pure fiction might actually exist. The sites themselves were surprisingly primitive. Basic interfaces that looked like they'd been cobbled together by amateurs. Most required payments through complicated systems, but several offered preview sections that were freely available. The previews were disturbing enough. Grainy footage of people in windowless rooms, movements too natural to be acted, reactions too genuine to be scripted. What bothered him most was how organized it seemed, despite the amateur appearance. This wasn't random content uploaded by individuals. Someone was running a proper operation with regular schedules and systematic approach. The forums contained discussions about production quality, request systems, and expansion plans. From what he could gather, the operation was smaller than the film had suggested, but more real. It seemed to be an emerging network, testing methods and building capabilities rather than some vast established enterprise. The amateurish appearance was deliberate, designed to look like a few perverts with cameras rather than something more coordinated. The discussions revealed they were actively recruiting both participants and what they called local assets, people who could provide information about potential targets in their areas. They weren't just looking for victims. They needed intelligence gatherers, people who understood local dynamics and could spot opportunities. Tom's mistake was engaging with the forum using the same username he'd used elsewhere online. His digital footprint was surprisingly extensive. Gaming forums, social media, even school project submissions. Anyone looking could piece together his real identity, location, and interests within hours. The first sign they'd noticed him came through his Discord server. Files appeared that he hadn't uploaded. Screenshots of his own posts, maps of Polperro with his cottage marked, even photos of him taken from his school's website. Someone had been systematically cataloging his online presence. His laptop's webcam began activating randomly, the little light blinking on during the night. When he covered it, files on his desktop would be subtly altered, documents renamed, folders reorganized, photos edited with barely visible changes. They were demonstrating access to his digital life, showing him how completely they could invade his privacy. The psychological pressure was subtle but effective. His browsing history would be altered to include sites he'd never visited. His social media accounts would show login attempts from locations across the country. And his email would receive messages that seemed to know details about his daily routine. Sleep became almost impossible. He'd lie awake wondering if the webcam was recording, if his microphone was listening, if his every keystroke was being monitored. The laptop that had been his window to the world became a source of constant anxiety. The surveillance escalated when someone began asking questions about him in the village. His mum mentioned that a stranger had approached her at the school, claiming to be conducting research on rural internet infrastructure. The questions had been specifically about teenage online habits and computer literacy in the area. They'd identified him as potentially useful, a tech-savvy local teenager with detailed knowledge of the community, living in an area with limited police presence and isolated enough for discreet operations. But more than that, they needed a test subject for their Cornwall expansion, and Tom had unknowingly volunteered by documenting his journey into their world. The breakthrough came when he found evidence of their local operations. Forum posts discussed reconnaissance trips to Cornwall, photos of abandoned buildings within driving distance of Polperro, and conversations about the advantages of working in rural areas. They weren't just theoretically interested in his region. They were actively preparing to operate there. More disturbing was discovering that several local teenagers were already being discussed as potential targets. He recognized names from his school, descriptions of people he knew. references to family situations and social media activity. The users weren't just planning, they were already gathering intelligence. The realization that he might have accidentally identified himself as both an asset and a target hit him hard. His online activities had demonstrated his capabilities, whilst his location made him valuable for local intelligence. By exploring their world, he'd made himself visible to people who specialized in exploiting curiosity. The direct contact began with a message on his Discord server. "We know you've been watching. Time to be useful." Attached was a single photo, his bedroom window, taken from outside the cottage. The message was clear. They could reach him whenever they wanted. Instead of dramatic confrontations, they offered a simple arrangement: help with basic intelligence gathering, monitoring social media, noting when people traveled, identifying vulnerable individuals, and his online activities would remain private. Refuse and his browsing history would be shared with his mum, his school, the local police. The work started small. Screenshot certain social media posts, note when families mentioned holiday plans, track the online activity of specific teenagers. Nothing that seemed directly harmful, but each task connected him deeper into their operations. Tom tried to resist, but the leverage was too strong. They'd compiled a comprehensive dossier of his dark web exploration, complete with timestamps, screenshots, and a detailed analysis of his interests. His curiosity had been weaponized against him. The psychological control was masterful. They never threatened violence, never demanded anything obviously criminal. Instead, they gradually normalized his cooperation, making each new request seem like a natural progression from the last. His moral boundaries eroded through small compromises that individually seemed manageable. One autumn evening, the power went out across the peninsula during a storm. Not the dramatic blackout of horror films, but the kind of routine outage that rural areas experience regularly. Tom's mum went to stay with a friend whose house had a generator, leaving him alone in the cottage. 2 days later, a small package arrived with no return address. Inside was a USB drive and a single slip of paper with login credentials. The drive contained access to a private forum where his username was already recognized. His handlers had decided his period of basic intelligence gathering was over. It was time for more direct involvement. The USB drive contained detailed profiles of local teenagers, complete with photos, social media analysis, and vulnerability assessments. His job was to verify the information, add local context, and identify the most promising targets. His transformation from observer to participant was complete. He spent the next several hours reading through files that contained painfully detailed information about people he'd known all his life. The profiles weren't just demographic data. They included psychological assessments, family dynamics, and exploitation strategies. Someone had invested serious effort in understanding his community. By dawn, he understood his true role in their operation. He wasn't just providing intelligence. He was helping them select victims from his own community. His local knowledge, gained through a lifetime of village life, was being used to identify which of his neighbors were most vulnerable to manipulation. The trap had been perfectly constructed. His eagerness to understand had provided the initial contact. His digital footprint had given them leverage, and his local knowledge made him indispensable. Every choice he'd made since watching that film had led him deeper into their web. The network's activities in Cornwall expanded gradually over the following months. Tom's intelligence proved accurate and valuable, enabling them to operate with confidence in an area they'd never worked before. Every few weeks, they'd remind him they still had the files, just in case he forgot. His cooperation had made their expansion possible. The guilt was overwhelming. Missing person reports, worried parents, teenagers who disappeared for days before returning changed, all traced back to information he'd provided. His questions had been transformed into complicity, his knowledge into a weapon against his own community. The authorities remained unaware of the network's activities. They investigated individual incidents without recognizing the pattern, pursued obvious suspects without understanding the sophisticated recruitment and control methods being employed. Their traditional approaches were inadequate for addressing a threat this well organized. Tom's academic performance collapsed as the psychological pressure mounted. He started keeping lists of everything he said to everyone, terrified he might forget who knew what. Teachers noticed his declining grades and withdrawal from social activities, but attributed them to typical teenage stress. The real source of his problems couldn't be discussed with anyone. The network continued to grow, not through dramatic expansion, but through careful cultivation of assets like Tom. They were building a distributed operation, using local knowledge and digital leverage to establish footholds in communities across the country. What had started as curiosity about a film had become participation in something far more sinister. The most disturbing realization was that Tom's story wasn't unique. The network's recruitment methods were systematic and repeatable, designed to convert questions into complicity. They were building a network of reluctant accomplices, each trapped by their own digital footprints and moral compromises. As I write this, Tom is still in Polperro, still providing intelligence, still carrying secrets that age him beyond his years. The boy who just wanted answers about a film has been replaced by someone who understands too much about the darkness that exists beneath the surface of normal life. The network continues to operate and expand, feeding on the natural inquisitiveness of young people who stumble across references to its activities. Each new recruit follows a similar path: initial questions, gradual involvement, eventual complicity. The cycle perpetuates itself, growing stronger with each iteration. But what haunts me most isn't Tom's story, or even the network's continued operation. It's the realization that right now, someone reading this might be wondering if such things could really exist. Someone might be inquisitive enough to start looking, to start searching, to take the first steps down a path that leads to the same destination. Have you ever wondered what happens to the parts of yourself you lose in war? Not the obvious bits, the limbs, the hearing, the scars you can see in the mirror. I'm talking about the invisible pieces, the ability to sleep through the night without checking the locks 3 times, the capacity to sit in a restaurant without your back to the wall, the simple faith that most people are fundamentally decent. Those are the parts that don't grow back, no matter how many therapy sessions the doctors threw at you. I came back from Afghanistan in late 2018, medically discharged after an IED took out half my patrol and left me with a collection of metal fragments in my left leg and a head full of memories I couldn't switch off. The physical therapy was straightforward enough. Learn to walk properly again, build up the strength, adapt to the new limitations. The mental side was trickier. The flat they set me up with in Aldershot was decent enough. Ground floor, which suited the leg, and quiet neighbours who minded their own business. The occupational therapist had been very pleased with herself when she'd arranged it. Close to the base for support, she'd said, but far enough away to feel civilian. What she hadn't mentioned was how the silence would press against your ears at night, or how every settling beam and creaking pipe would send your heart racing. Sleep became something that happened to other people. I'd lie there listening to the world outside my window. The occasional car, a fox in the bins, the milk float doing its rounds at 4:30. Sometimes I'd doze off around dawn, only to wake up an hour later feeling worse than when I'd gone to bed. That's how I discovered the internet had a whole world that came alive when the rest of Britain was asleep. Forums for insomniacs, chat rooms for shift workers, communities of people who existed in the margins of normal daylight hours. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just human contact that didn't require explaining why I was awake at 3 in the morning or why crowds made me nervous. The transition from regular internet to the darker corners happened gradually. Someone in an insomnia forum mentioned privacy tools, ways to browse without leaving digital footprints. Given my background, the concept of operational security appealed to me. Old habits, I suppose. In the army, you learn to cover your tracks, to move without being seen, to gather intelligence without revealing your position. Installing Tor felt like putting on body armor, that same sense of protection, of creating barriers between yourself and potential threats. The dark web wasn't what I'd expected. Less criminal marketplace, more like a parallel internet where people could speak freely about things that wouldn't be tolerated on Facebook or Twitter. Political dissidents, whistleblowers, people living under authoritarian regimes. It felt purposeful, almost noble. The first few weeks I just observed. Reading forums about government surveillance, privacy rights, digital freedom. There was something therapeutic about it. Being part of a community that understood the value of staying hidden, of operating below the radar. These people got it in a way that civilian therapists never could. It was in one of these privacy forums that I first heard about red rooms, not from someone promoting them, but from a discussion about online myths and digital urban legends. Someone had posted a long thread debunking various dark web horror stories, explaining how most of the sensational stuff you read in newspapers was either exaggerated or completely fabricated. Red rooms, according to this poster, were particularly ridiculous. The technical challenges alone made them impractical. Streaming live video over Tor was unreliable, the latency was terrible, and the bandwidth requirements were enormous. More importantly, they argued, the risk to reward ratio made no sense. Why would criminals expose themselves to that level of surveillance and law enforcement attention when there were easier ways to make money? The post was thorough, well-researched, and completely convincing. It also had the unintended effect of making me curious about whether they actually existed. I told myself it was just intellectual curiosity. After years of intelligence work, you develop a natural skepticism about official narratives. When someone tells you something is impossible, your first instinct is to test that assertion. Not because you want to find something horrific, but because you want to understand how the world actually works, rather than how people say it works. The search took weeks. Most of the links I found led to obvious scams, sites demanding payment upfront or requiring personal information that any sensible person would never provide. Others were clearly honey traps, probably run by law enforcement agencies trying to catch people with questionable intentions. But occasionally, buried deep in technical discussions or hidden in the metadata of seemingly unrelated files, I'd find references that seemed more genuine. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. I'd been helping out at a veteran support group, not talking, just making tea and setting up chairs, when I overheard a conversation between two ex-Signals operators about online payment systems. They were discussing the profit margins on different digital services, and one of them mentioned that the real money wasn't in legitimate businesses, but in providing services that people couldn't get through normal channels. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. But something about the way he'd said it stuck with me. The next time I was browsing the dark web, I started looking at it differently. Instead of searching for red rooms directly, I started following the money, payment processors, digital transfer systems, the financial infrastructure that would be needed to support something like live streaming to paying customers. That's how I found the marketplace. It was hidden several layers deep, accessible only through a series of referral links that changed daily. The front page looked like any other dark web market. Drugs, fake documents, stolen credit card details. But there was a section marked Premium Services that required additional verification to access. The verification process was more thorough than anything I'd encountered. Not just prepayment through untraceable methods, but proof of identity that had to be cross-referenced against previous purchases, references from existing members, even a brief interview conducted through encrypted chat to confirm you weren't law enforcement. It took nearly a month to get approved, and by the time I did, I wasn't sure I actually wanted access anymore. But the same compulsion that had carried me through 3 tours in Afghanistan, the need to see a mission through to completion, kept me going. The Premium Services section was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 30 or 40 listings, mostly for things that were disturbing, but not particularly surprising. Custom pornography, identity theft services, professional harassment campaigns, the sort of services that existed in the grey areas between legal and illegal, catering to people with money and flexible morals. The listings that interested me were at the bottom of the page in a subcategory marked Live Entertainment. 3 different providers, each offering real-time streaming services with interactive elements. The descriptions were deliberately vague. Authentic experiences, unscripted content, viewer participation opportunities. But the prices gave them away. These weren't webcam shows or adult entertainment. They were charging thousands of pounds for single sessions. I spent another week researching the providers before making contact with one. Their listing claimed to offer documentary-style content featuring real participants in authentic scenarios. The language was careful, designed to provide plausible deniability while making the actual service clear to interested buyers. The booking process was surprisingly professional. Encrypted email exchanges, detailed technical requirements for viewing, even a customer service representative who walked me through the setup process. They operated like a legitimate business, complete with scheduling systems and technical support. The session was arranged for a Tuesday night at 11:30. I was provided with a unique link and access credentials that would only work during a specific 2-hour window. The technical requirements were extensive: updated browsers, specific security plugins, a reliable internet connection with minimum bandwidth requirements. When the time came, I almost didn't connect. I sat at my laptop for nearly 20 minutes, cursor hovering over the link, trying to decide if I really wanted to see what I was about to see. In the end, it was the same morbid curiosity that had carried me this far. I needed to know if it was real. The stream loaded slowly, buffering every few seconds as the encrypted video fought its way through Tor's layered network. When it finally stabilized, I was looking at what appeared to be a basement or cellar. Concrete walls, a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, and a chair positioned in the center of the frame. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. Just an empty room with occasionally flickering lighting. As the video quality adjusted, I was beginning to think I'd been scammed when a figure appeared at the edge of the frame. It was a man in his 40s or 50s, wearing coveralls and latex gloves. He moved methodically around the room, checking equipment I couldn't quite see, adjusting the camera angle. preparing for something. His movements were practiced, professional. This wasn't his first time doing whatever he was about to do. A chat window had appeared beside the video player, showing messages from other viewers. There weren't many, maybe 8 or 10 people total, but they were clearly regulars. They talked about previous sessions, compared notes on different providers, discussed technical aspects of the streaming quality like they were reviewing a television program. Then someone else entered the room. She was young, probably early 20s, and clearly confused about where she was or how she'd gotten there. The man in coveralls guided her to the chair with gentle but firm insistence, speaking to her in what appeared to be a calming manner. She kept looking around the room, taking in the concrete walls and bare bulb and camera equipment with growing alarm. The chat exploded with activity. Viewers were making requests, placing bets, discussing what they wanted to see happen next. Payment details were being shared. Transactions were being arranged in real time. I watched in horrified fascination as what I was witnessing transformed from documentary into auction. I should have closed the browser, should have reported what I was seeing to the police, though I had no idea how to explain how I'd found it, or whether they'd even believe me. Instead, I found myself paralyzed by the same terrible fascination that had carried me through firefights in Helmand, that state of hyper-awareness where time slows down and you observe everything with crystalline clarity while being unable to act. The man in coveralls began responding to specific requests from the chat. He would pause, read something on a screen I couldn't see, then nod or shake his head. Sometimes he would hold up different tools for the camera, letting the viewers choose which one he should use. It was interactive in the most disturbing way possible. A live-streamed crime where the audience was complicit in every decision. Then something changed. The chat messages stopped, replaced by a single repeated warning from multiple users. Terminate session, terminate session, terminate session. The man in coveralls looked directly at the camera, his expression shifting from professional calm to genuine alarm. He moved quickly to something off screen, and seconds later the video cut out entirely. I stared at a blank screen, showing only a connection error message. When I tried to reload the page, the link was dead. The entire marketplace had vanished, as if it had never existed at all. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that what I'd witnessed had been staged. Elaborate theatre designed to part fools from their money. The production quality had been too professional, the interactive elements too seamless. Real criminals wouldn't operate with such sophisticated customer service and technical infrastructure. But I kept thinking about those final moments before the feed cut out. The way the man's expression had changed when he'd seen those warning messages. The speed with which everything had shut down. It felt less like a performance ending and more like an emergency evacuation. 3 weeks later, I received a package. It arrived by regular post, addressed to my flat with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, printed on ordinary paper with a home printer. It showed the interior of my living room, taken from the position of my laptop screen. I was visible in the background, sitting at my kitchen table, clearly recognizable despite the low light. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a single line in neat handwriting. "We know what you watched." I called the police immediately, reported the break-in, showed them the photograph, explained about the package. But what could they do? No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, no way to trace where the photograph had come from. The officer who took my statement was polite, but clearly thought I was either paranoid or making it up. I've changed the logs 3 times since then, installed security cameras, motion sensors. even hired a private investigator to check if anyone had been asking questions about me. Nothing. Whoever had been in my flat had left no trace beyond that single photograph. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying awake, listening to the sounds of the building settling around me, I wonder if they ever really left. Because the thing about surveillance is that once you know you're being watched, you never stop feeling those eyes on you. I still get packages occasionally, never more than once a month, always delivered by regular post. Sometimes it's another photograph, my kitchen, my bedroom, the view from my living room window. Once it was a printout of my medical records from the army. Last month it was a copy of my therapy notes from the NHS. Each one carries the same message on the back. We know what you watched. I don't know if it's a threat or just a reminder. I don't know if they want something from me, or if they're simply ensuring I remember what I witnessed. But I've learned that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The worst part isn't the invasion of privacy, or even the constant feeling of being monitored. It's knowing that somewhere out there, that basement with the concrete walls and single bare bulb might still be operating. That other people might be sitting at their computers right now, watching live streams of things that should never happen, placing bets on human suffering like it's a sporting event. And I'm the only one who knows it's real. At least, I hope I'm the only one. The photograph is still on my mantelpiece. I haven't moved it, and I'm not going to, because removing it would feel like a kind of defeat, like allowing what happened to reach back and erase something it has no right to touch. It's a picture of my late husband Gerald and me on the Pembrokeshire coastal path, taken by a stranger we'd handed our camera to somewhere above St. Bride's Bay. Gerald is squinting into the sun, and I am laughing at something he'd said a moment before the shutter clicked, and the sea behind us is that particular shade of blue that only happens on the best Welsh summer days, the kind of blue that seems too vivid to be real. We look happy because we were happy. 31 years of marriage, and that is still one of my favorite photographs of us. I keep it there because I refuse to let what came after take it from me. That's where I need to start. With Gerald and with Wales, and with the particular shape my life had taken by the time I was 67 and living alone in a stone cottage outside Aberaeron on the Ceredigion coast. Gerald died 4 years before any of this happened. A cardiac event, that's the phrase the doctors used, which always struck me as oddly neutral for something so absolute. He was in the garden when it happened. In May, the roses he'd been nursing for years just coming into colour. I found him when I went out to call him for lunch. I won't describe that in detail because that grief is private, and also because it isn't the point of what I'm telling you. The point is the aftermath. The long rearranging of a life that had been organised around two people and now had to accommodate one. The silence in the evenings, the single cup of tea, the way the cottage, which I had always loved, began to feel in certain lights like a place I was maintaining rather than inhabiting. My daughter Stacey lives in Bristol with her husband and their 2 children. My son Rodri is in Edinburgh. They rang regularly and visited when they could, and worried about me in the way that adult children worry about a widowed parent. Sincerely, but at a distance. Reassured too easily when I said I was fine. I was fine mostly. I had friends in the village and in Aberaeron. I walked the coastal path 3 mornings a week, regardless of weather. I kept a garden that Gerald would have approved of and read more than I ever had when life had been fuller. I managed. But managing and flourishing are different things, and I was under no illusion about which one I was doing. The laptop was Stacy's idea. She set it up during a visit in the autumn after Gerald died, walked me through the basics, installed things she said I'd find useful, and left me with a printed sheet of instructions I consulted for months. I was not a natural with it. I'd used computers at the primary school where I'd taught for 30 years, but that was different, purposeful, bounded, nothing like the open endlessness of the internet approached without a specific task in mind. I used it cautiously at first. News, recipes, video calls with the grandchildren on Sunday evenings that became one of the fixed points of my week. Somewhere in the second year, I found a forum for people who'd been bereaved later in life. I stumbled onto it via an article I'd been reading, and I lurked for weeks before I posted anything, reading other people's accounts of loss with the particular relief of recognizing your own experience in someone else's words. When I did post, it was tentatively. A few sentences about Gerald, about the garden, about the way certain times of day were harder than others. The responses were kind, genuinely kind, in the way that strangers sometimes manage more readily than people who know you and are frightened by the proximity of your grief. I became a regular. I found people I looked forward to hearing from, whose situations I'd followed over months and whose small recoveries felt like shared victories. It was a measured and appropriate thing, that forum. It gave me something to look forward to in the evenings. It was good for me. I want to say that clearly, because what happened later has a way of casting everything before it in a suspicious light, and the forum was not suspicious. The forum was just a group of older people being honest about loss. That was where I first encountered the person who called himself David. He had been on the forum for a few months before he wrote to me directly. He was, according to his profile, 64, widowed 2 years previously, living in Shropshire, retired from a career in civil engineering. He had a way of writing that was measured and thoughtful, never performatively emotional, which I appreciated. Some people on the forum used it almost competitively, each post an escalation of suffering, and David was not like that. He was restrained, interested in others. He'd replied to several of my posts with observations that suggested he'd actually read what I'd written, rather than simply waiting for a space to respond. When he wrote to me privately, it was to share a piece by a Welsh poet he thought I might appreciate, given something I'd mentioned about walking the coastal path. He was right that I'd appreciate it. I did. I said so, and we began corresponding separately from the forum, through the messaging system it provided, and it was pleasant in a way I hadn't expected. A genuine exchange of ideas between two people at similar stages of life with overlapping sensibilities. We talked about books and about landscape and about the strange mathematics of grief, the way certain days ambushed you and others were unexpectedly bearable. Gerald would have liked the way the garden looks in October. The roses are finished, but the sedums have gone that deep bronze color he always loved. And the light in the afternoons falls across the back wall in a way that has not changed in 31 years. And sometimes I stand at the kitchen window, and the ordinary beauty of it is so acute I have to look away. I stood at that window on the morning I first felt properly uneasy about David. I couldn't have told you exactly why. It was the accumulation of small things, in the way that these recognitions usually are. By January, we had been corresponding for about 4 months. He had, at some point in November, suggested moving our conversations to a different platform, a messaging application I hadn't used before, which he explained allowed longer messages and was easier to navigate than the forum system. I downloaded it with Stacy's help during a phone call in which I mentioned I'd been chatting with someone from the forum, and in which she said that was lovely, Mum, in the tone of someone who is reassured and not paying quite enough attention. The new platform was easier, as he'd said. The conversations became more frequent, sometimes daily. David was good company. He was funny in a dry, understated way, and he was curious about my life in a manner that felt like interest rather than interrogation. He asked about the coastal path, and about Abereron, and about the grandchildren, and about what Gerald had been like, and I found myself describing Gerald in more detail than I had to anyone since the funeral, and it felt good to do that, to put him into words for someone who hadn't known him. The first thing that pulled at me slightly was in December. David mentioned a health difficulty. Nothing serious, he said. A recurring problem with his back that had been keeping him at home more than usual, limiting his walking. He described it in passing, and I expressed sympathy, and the conversation moved on. But a week later, when I mentioned something about the walks I'd been taking, he made a reference to his back that contradicted a detail he'd given me the previous week. Small enough that I almost didn't catch it. Small enough that I'd written it off as misremembering, as the natural imprecision of ordinary conversation, before I was even consciously aware I'd noticed it. I noticed it. The photograph above the fireplace, Gerald squinting. The blue that seems too vivid. That same summer we ate crab on the harbour at Abereron, and Gerald got sunburned across his nose and was absurdly pleased about it, said it made him look like a sailor. I have been thinking about that holiday a great deal in the past year, about how entirely uncomplicated it was, about the version of myself in that photograph, who had no idea how much weight the future was preparing to hand her. In January, he asked for my phone number. He framed it naturally, in the context of a conversation about a film we'd both mentioned wanting to watch, suggesting we might enjoy discussing it afterwards if we could speak directly rather than type. It was a reasonable request, and I had no concrete reason to refuse it, and I sat with my hands over the keyboard for longer than I should have before I typed a response. I didn't give him my number. I said I preferred to keep things written for now, that I found it easier, which was true as far as it went. He accepted it without apparent difficulty, said of course he understood completely, and we moved on. But the question had shifted something, and in the days after I found myself looking back over our conversations with a different quality of attention, what I noticed, working backwards through the months, was a pattern of accumulation I hadn't seen while I was inside it. He knew, by January, a very complete picture of my life. He knew the layout of my cottage, described across multiple conversations. He knew my routine, the morning walks, the village shop on Thursdays, the Sunday video calls with the grandchildren. He knew the names of my children and where they lived, and roughly when they visited. He knew I lived alone. He knew the nearest town and could, if he'd wanted to, have identified the cottage from the details I'd given about its position above the estuary. He had never, I realized, told me anything of comparable specificity about himself. I'd asked over the months, and he'd answered, but the answers had always been slightly general, slightly unverifiable. A town in Shropshire, a career in an industry I knew nothing about, a house he'd described only in the vaguest terms. He'd given me enough to feel like reciprocity without giving me anything I could confirm or locate. I thought about the detail that had contradicted itself in December. I thought about the slight precision with which he had catalogued my life while keeping his own behind gauze. I told Stacey. I rang her on a Tuesday evening, and I told her all of it, and I heard the quality of her silence as she listened. Stacey's husband worked in financial services and had a colleague with a background in online fraud investigation, and through that connection, which moved quickly once Stacey understood what I was describing, someone looked of what they could find about the account David had been using on the forum. The account was 14 months old. It had no online presence before the forum. The email address connected to it resolved to an account created a week before the forum registration. The profile photograph: a pleasant-faced man in his 60s in a garden setting. The kind of unremarkable image that registers as genuine precisely because it is so unremarkable. Was a stock photograph available through an image library. Not a real person, not anyone's actual face. The investigator found something else, working through a connection I don't fully understand and won't try to explain. The messaging application David had asked me to download, the one that was easier than the forum system that allowed longer messages, had been used from an account linked by an IP address to a cluster of similar accounts, all created within a short window of time, all used to contact women over 60 living alone. Not in Wales specifically, across the UK. Some of the accounts had been active for over 2 years. There was a thread on a part of the internet that required specific access to reach, in which those accounts were discussed. A community organized around the targeted approach and manipulation of elderly women living alone, sharing methods, recording successes, exchanging the personal details they had extracted, discussing the most effective pace of escalation, the most productive questions, the tells that indicated a target was becoming isolated enough to approach more directly. My name was in one of the threads. My address was in one of the threads. Not just the village, the cottage, the position above the estuary. A description of the exterior accurate enough that I understood with cold certainty that someone had looked at it. Not from the road, but from the estuary path below, which is a public path, which anyone could walk. The thread was dated 3 weeks before David had asked for my phone number. The discussion in it concerned the optimal timing for a physical approach given what had been established about my routine. The Thursday shop, the morning walks, the Sunday calls. My routine, mapped and shared among strangers, on a thread I would never have found without help, for a purpose that the investigator described to me in careful and measured language, while Stacy held my hand across the kitchen table. The police were involved, a specialist unit that dealt with online exploitation of older adults, which exists because this is not rare, because there are communities built around this specific category of harm, because the patience and the methodology and the long careful accumulation of a vulnerable person's trust is something that has been refined and shared and improved upon in corners of the internet where no ordinary search would find it. The account that called itself David was linked to an individual who was eventually identified and prosecuted. I was not the only woman. I was not the most recent. The thread that contained my address contained 6 other addresses, and the conversations recorded in the same cluster of accounts showed the same structure repeated across different women, different counties, different names and routines and layouts of home. The same patience, the same questions, the same gradual accumulation of everything needed to locate and approach someone who had been made through months of careful cultivation to feel less alone. I did not go to court. I was not required to. I was kept informed at each stage by a liaison officer who was thorough and kind and who told me at the conclusion of the case that my call to Stacy had likely prevented something that she could not specify in legal terms, but which the pattern of the other cases made sufficiently clear. I keep that photograph on the mantelpiece because I refuse to let what happened take anything further from me than it already has. What it has taken is harder to name than a photograph. It is the ease I used to have with strangers, the open quality of my attention when someone shows interest, the willingness to describe where I live and how I live without a layer of calculation underneath. I had not, at 67, expected to have to learn those things. I had thought that the worst the world could do to me had already been done, in a garden in May, beside roses that were just coming into colour. I was wrong about that. There is always, it turns out, another thing to lose and another kind of person willing to take it. I walk the coastal path 3 mornings a week. I tend the garden. I see the grandchildren on Sundays, and I love those calls with a fierceness that would probably embarrass me if I said it aloud. I am still on the bereavement forum, because the forum did not do anything wrong, and the people on it are genuine, and the kindness I found there was real, even if one of the presences I took for real was not. I am more careful now, more deliberate about what I say and to whom, and how much I allow the picture to be assembled. I check, now, in ways I did not check before, whether what a person is giving me matches what I am giving them. It is a poorer way to move through the world, that vigilance. It costs something every day. The photograph is still on the mantelpiece, Gerald squinting, me laughing at something that is lost now, something private, something from before. The blue behind us that seems too vivid to be real. It was real. That's the thing I hold on to. That particular blue, that particular day, that particular version of myself with no idea what was coming. All of it was real, and it happened, and nobody can reach back and take it away. Some things, it turns out, they cannot touch. I've always been the responsible type. Growing up, I was the kid who reminded teachers about homework and never forgot to lock the front door. My mum used to say I was born middle-aged, which wasn't exactly a compliment, but wasn't entirely wrong either. That reliability served me well when I moved to Manchester for university. While my course mates were getting bladdered every night and sleeping through lectures, I kept my head down, studied hard, and managed my money carefully. By my second year, I built up a decent reputation as someone who could be trusted with responsibilities that other students would probably mess up. That's how I ended up house-sitting for Professor Williams. She taught European history and lived in one of those Victorian terraces in Didsbury that academics always seem to end up in. The place was filled with books and quirky furniture, looking like it had been furnished entirely from charity shops, but somehow working perfectly together. She'd been recommended for a visiting fellowship at Oxford and needed someone reliable to look after her house for 6 months. The arrangement was brilliant for me. Free accommodation in a much nicer area than I could normally afford, plus a small monthly payment for handling basic maintenance and keeping the place secure. All I had to do was water her plants, deal with any post, and make sure the house didn't get broken into while she was away. Professor Williams was thorough about explaining everything before she left. Which plants needed watering when, how to work the ancient central heating system, where the stopcock was in case of emergencies. She showed me around every room, pointing out anything that might need attention and making sure I understood how everything worked. The house was larger than it looked from outside, with rooms that seemed to have been added on over the years without much planning. There was a study lined with books from floor to ceiling, a conservatory full of plants that she was particularly worried about, and a cellar that she used for storage, but told me I probably wouldn't need to access. She also had a small office upstairs where she did her research, with a computer and filing cabinets full of what looked like academic papers and correspondence. She asked me not to disturb anything in there, which was fine by me. I had no interest in medieval trade routes, or whatever it was she specialized in. The first few weeks went smoothly. I settled into a routine of checking the plants every couple of days, bringing in any post, and generally making sure everything was ticking over normally. The house was comfortable and quiet, much better for studying than my previous shared accommodation, where someone was always playing music or having people round. Professor Williams had left me her contact details and asked me to send weekly updates about how everything was going. Just brief emails letting her know that the house was fine and there were no problems. She was clearly quite anxious about leaving her home for such a long period, which I could understand given how much stuff she had accumulated over the years. But after about a month, I started receiving emails from her that seemed odd. She began asking very specific questions about things happening around the house, whether I'd noticed anyone lurking in the street outside, if any post had arrived that wasn't addressed to her, whether I'd heard any unusual noises during the night. The sort of questions that suggested she was worried about something more serious than just general burglary concerns. When I assured her that everything was completely normal and quiet, she seemed relieved, but also somehow surprised, as if she'd been expecting something to happen and was puzzled that it hadn't occurred yet. She also started giving me additional instructions about security, making sure all windows were locked every night, not answering the door to anyone I didn't recognize, being careful about what information I shared if neighbors asked questions about her absence. Again, sensible precautions, but the level of concern seemed disproportionate to the actual risks. I began paying more attention to the house and neighborhood, wondering if there was something I'd missed that was making Professor Williams so anxious. But Didsbury was exactly the sort of middle-class area where the biggest crime problem was probably bicycle theft. The neighbors were friendly but not intrusive. The street was well lit and regularly patrolled, and I'd never felt unsafe walking around at any time of day or night. The house itself also seemed perfectly secure. Good locks on all the doors and windows, a modern alarm system, even security lights that came on automatically if anyone approached the property after dark. Whatever Professor Williams was worried about, she'd clearly taken reasonable precautions to protect against it. That's when I started exploring the house more thoroughly. I'd been respectful of her privacy during the first month, staying in the main living areas and only going into other rooms when necessary for maintenance. But her increasingly worried emails made me curious about whether there was something about the property that she hadn't mentioned during her initial tour. The study and conservatory were exactly as she'd shown me. Nothing unusual or concerning. Her bedroom and the guest room where I was staying were also completely normal. But when I started looking more carefully at the upstairs office, I noticed things that hadn't registered during my initial visit. The filing cabinets contained much more than just academic research. There were folders full of correspondence with solicitors, insurance companies, and what appeared to be private investigators. Legal documents related to property disputes, insurance claims for items that had apparently been stolen, even what looked like restraining orders taken out against individuals whose names I didn't recognize. Professor Williams had clearly been dealing with some serious problems that went well beyond normal academic concerns. The computer in her office was password protected, but she'd left it logged in with several browser windows open. Most were related to her research, but there were also tabs showing websites that specialized in personal security and surveillance detection. Forums where people discussed stalking, harassment, and methods for protecting yourself against individuals who posed ongoing threats. It was becoming clear that Professor Williams's anxiety about house security wasn't general paranoia. She was dealing with specific threats from people who had targeted her in the past and might try to access her property while she was away. I started reading through more of the documents in her filing cabinets, trying to understand what kind of situation I'd gotten myself involved with. What I found was a pattern of harassment and intimidation that had been going on for several years. Someone had been systematically targeting Professor Williams with various forms of harassment, items stolen from her garden, threatening letters posted through her door, even incidents of people attempting to break into her house while she was asleep. She'd reported everything to the police, but they'd been unable to identify the perpetrators or provide effective protection. The harassment seemed to be connected to her academic work, specifically research she'd been conducting into historical property ownership in the Manchester area. Some of her findings had apparently contradicted claims made by individuals who were involved in contemporary property disputes, and they'd responded by trying to intimidate her into retracting or modifying her conclusions. But the harassment had escalated beyond simple intimidation. Recent incidents included evidence that someone had been inside her house while she was away, moving items around and accessing her computer and files. Professional security assessments had confirmed that her property was being monitored by people with sophisticated surveillance equipment and detailed knowledge of her daily routine. The Oxford Fellowship hadn't been an academic opportunity. It had been an escape route. Professor Williams had accepted the position specifically to get away from Manchester until the harassment situation could be resolved. She'd hoped that a 6-month absence would convince her tormentors to move on to other targets. But leaving the house empty created new vulnerabilities. If the people harassing her were primarily interested in her research and files, an unoccupied property would provide the perfect opportunity for them to search through everything without interference. That's why she'd been so specific about security precautions and had asked for such detailed updates about any unusual activity. She wasn't just worried about burglary. She was expecting her harassers to use her absence as an opportunity to break in and steal or destroy her research materials. I realized I was essentially being used as a human security system, positioned in the house to deter break-in attempts and alert her if anyone tried to access her property. But I had no idea how dangerous these people might be or what they'd do if they discovered someone was living in the house they were planning to search. Professor Williams hadn't told me any of this because she'd known I probably wouldn't have agreed to house sit if I'd understood the real risks involved. Instead, she'd presented it as a straightforward arrangement that would benefit both of us while concealing the fact that I might be putting myself in serious danger. I considered confronting her about the deception, but I was also curious about what exactly she'd discovered that had made these people so determined to stop her research. The academic papers in her filing system were dense and technical, full of references to medieval property records and land ownership disputes that seemed unlikely to generate such extreme reactions. But when I started looking at her more recent work, I found research that was much more contemporary and potentially controversial. Professor Williams had been investigating connections between historical property ownership and modern property development in Manchester. Specifically, she'd been tracing how certain pieces of land had been acquired, developed, and transferred over several centuries, revealing patterns that suggested some contemporary property holdings might be based on fraudulent historical claims. Her research had identified several prominent Manchester property developers whose holdings appeared to be derived from land that had been acquired through forged documents, bribery, and other illegal methods during the 19th and early 20th centuries. If her findings were accurate, these developers' current property empires could be vulnerable to legal challenges that might cost them millions of pounds. That would certainly explain why someone might be willing to use harassment and intimidation to prevent her research from being published or used in legal proceedings. But it also meant that the people targeting her weren't just academic rivals or cranks with grievances about historical interpretations. they were potentially connected to serious criminal enterprises with substantial financial resources and a willingness to use violence to protect their interests. I was now living in a house that contained evidence of major property fraud, being targeted by people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use illegal methods to suppress inconvenient research. Professor Williams's increasingly worried emails suddenly made much more sense. She wasn't just concerned about burglary. She was terrified that her research would be destroyed and that anyone protecting it might be seriously harmed in the process. I started taking much more serious security precautions, double-checking all locks every night, varying my daily routine to make it harder for anyone to predict when I'd be home, even researching escape routes from the house in case someone tried to break in while I was there. But I also began preparing to document and preserve Professor Williams's research in case something did happen to the original materials. If people were willing to commit serious crimes to suppress her findings, those findings were probably important enough to deserve protection. I started copying her files onto external storage devices, uploading important documents to secure cloud storage, even photographing particularly crucial papers so there would be multiple backups if the originals were destroyed. As I worked through her research more systematically, I began to understand why it posed such a serious threat to certain property developers. Her historical analysis didn't just identify questionable land acquisitions. It provided detailed documentation that could be used in court to challenge the legal ownership of some of Manchester's most valuable commercial and residential properties. Property worth hundreds of millions of pounds could potentially be redistributed if her research was accepted as evidence in legal proceedings. Entire business empires could collapse if the historical ownership claims they were based on were proven to be fraudulent. That level of financial exposure would certainly justify extreme measures to prevent the research from becoming public knowledge. But I also realized that simply copying and storing the research wasn't enough to protect it. If the people targeting Professor Williams discovered that backup copies existed, they'd probably escalate their efforts to suppress the information entirely. Anyone known to have access to her research would become a target for the same harassment and intimidation she'd experienced. And unlike an established academic with tenure and institutional support, a student house-sitter would be much more vulnerable to serious threats. I was sitting on evidence of major crimes committed by people with significant resources and demonstrated willingness to use illegal methods to protect their interests. Even if I tried to distance myself from the situation, I now knew too much to be completely safe from retaliation. The house-sitting arrangement that had seemed like such a good opportunity was actually a trap that had put me in serious danger without my knowledge or consent. That's when I started noticing signs that the house was being watched. Cars parked in the street for longer than normal, with occupants who seemed to be observing the property rather than visiting neighbors. People walking past more frequently than you'd expect for a quiet residential street, sometimes making multiple passes within short periods. Most concerning were indications that someone had been testing the house's security measures. Scratch marks around lock mechanisms that suggested attempted lockpicking, footprints in flower beds near windows, even what looked like small electronic devices attached to the property's exterior that might have been surveillance equipment. Professor Williams's harassers had apparently identified the house as a target and were conducting reconnaissance in preparation for a break-in attempt. I tried contacting her to report these developments, but her responses became increasingly evasive. She seemed reluctant to discuss specific security concerns and kept redirecting the conversation to routine house maintenance issues, as if she was worried that our email communications might be monitored by the same people who were targeting her research. When I pressed her for clearer guidance about what to do if I discovered evidence of attempted break-ins, she suggested that I might want to consider ending the house-sitting arrangement early and returning to normal student accommodation. But by this point, I was too invested in protecting her research to simply walk away. The historical property fraud she'd uncovered was exactly the sort of investigative journalism I hoped to pursue after graduation. Her work represented years of careful research that could expose serious crimes and help victims recover property that had been stolen from their families generations earlier. If I abandoned the house and her research was destroyed, important evidence of historical injustices would be lost forever. I decided to stay and take whatever precautions I could to protect both the property and the research materials. But I also started preparing for the possibility that the harassment might escalate to direct confrontation. That preparation turned out to be necessary sooner than I'd expected. I woke up 3 nights later to the sound of someone trying to force open the back door of the house, not attempting to pick the lock or disable the alarm system, just using brute force to break through the door and gain entry as quickly as possible. I had maybe 30 seconds before they got inside. Have you ever wondered what it's like to watch someone being murdered and not realize it until months later? 3 months ago, I was just a night security guard at a business park in Reading, spending my shifts reading books and doing crosswords. Now, I'm in protective custody somewhere in Wales, and my testimony about what I saw through CCTV cameras could expose a Red Room operation that's been broadcasting murders to thousands of viewers, while I unknowingly watched it all happen in real time. I've worked security for Morrison Security Services for about 2 years. It's easy work most of the time. Monitor CCTV feeds, do periodic building checks, log any incidents in the security report. The business park I cover has about 20 units, mostly small manufacturing companies and storage facilities that operate during normal business hours. My job is to make sure nothing gets broken into overnight. The unit that changed everything was Industrial Solutions Loyalty, a company that rented one of the larger warehouse spaces about 4 months ago. According to their lease application, they were in import-export, dealing with specialized equipment for various industries. They kept normal business hours initially, with delivery trucks arriving during the day and staff leaving by early evening. Industrial Solutions was run by a man called David Chen, who seemed professional and legitimate when he signed the lease. He explained that his company required enhanced security and privacy due to the sensitive nature of their work with international clients. This meant upgrading the CCTV coverage in their section of the business park and installing additional monitoring equipment. The upgraded surveillance system was impressive. High-definition cameras with night vision capabilities, audio recording equipment, and monitoring software that could track movement patterns and identify unusual activity. David explained that his clients required this level of security documentation for insurance and compliance purposes. As the security guard responsible for monitoring these feeds, I was trained to use the new equipment and given specific instructions about documenting any activity around Industrial Solutions. This included logging delivery times, recording visitor details, and maintaining detailed reports about anyone who accessed their facility outside normal business hours. Initially, everything seemed routine. Delivery trucks during the day, occasional evening meetings with what appeared to be international clients, and standard warehouse activities. The enhanced CCTV coverage meant I could monitor their operations more thoroughly than other units, but nothing seemed suspicious or concerning. About 6 weeks after Industrial Solutions moved in, their activity patterns began to change. Instead of finishing by early evening, staff would often remain until very late at night. The types of deliveries also shifted. Fewer commercial trucks and more unmarked vans arriving at unusual hours, often staying for extended periods. David explained these changes when I mentioned them in my security reports. He said the company was expanding into time-sensitive international markets that required round-the-clock operations. The unusual delivery schedule was necessary to coordinate with clients in different time zones who needed immediate access to specialized equipment. The nighttime activities gradually became more frequent and elaborate. I'd watch through the CCTV feeds as people moved equipment around the warehouse, set up what appeared to be temporary work areas, and conducted meetings that sometimes lasted until dawn. The enhanced surveillance system captured everything in remarkable detail. Around this time, David asked me to expand my monitoring responsibilities. Beyond standard security surveillance, he needed detailed documentation of all activities around their facility for what he called operational compliance purposes. This meant reviewing recorded footage, creating timestamped logs of events, and maintaining archives of particularly important activities. The compliance documentation work paid substantially better than standard security duties, and David assured me it was just administrative record-keeping required by his international clients. I welcomed the additional income and found the work straightforward enough, essentially creating detailed reports about what I was already observing through the CCTV system. As weeks passed, the activities I was documenting became increasingly unusual. The warehouse would be reconfigured regularly, with temporary structures assembled and dismantled between sessions. Professional lighting equipment would be set up around specific areas, along with what appeared to be sophisticated recording devices. When I asked David about these activities, he explained that Industrial Solutions had expanded into creating training materials and documentation for their international clients. The temporary setups were necessary for filming instructional videos about equipment operation and safety procedures. The training sessions always followed similar patterns: extensive preparation involving equipment setup and lighting configuration, followed by what appeared to be filming activities, then thorough cleanup and equipment removal. My role was to document the timing and participants involved in these sessions for compliance purposes. The people involved in these training sessions seemed to change regularly, with new participants arriving for each filming event. David explained that this was because they were creating materials for different types of equipment and needed specialists with relevant expertise for each training video. What struck me as odd was how the participants behaved during these sessions. Unlike normal training or instructional filming, the people involved seemed distressed or reluctant. When I mentioned this in my reports, David assured me that realistic safety training required participants to demonstrate genuine concern about potential hazards. About 2 months ago, I started noticing technical equipment around the Industrial Solutions facility that seemed more sophisticated than necessary for creating training videos. Multiple camera angles, professional audio systems, and computer equipment that appeared designed for live broadcasting rather than simple recording. David explained that their clients required real-time access to training materials, necessitating live streaming capabilities. The enhanced technical setup allowed them to broadcast training sessions to international audiences who couldn't attend in person. This explained the sophisticated equipment and the emphasis on precise timing for their filming sessions. My documentation responsibilities expanded to include monitoring the technical aspects of these broadcasts, verifying that streaming equipment was functioning correctly, logging connection quality issues, and maintaining records of broadcast durations and viewer access logs that David's system automatically generated. The viewer logs were remarkable in their scope. thousands of people from around the world were accessing these training broadcasts, with detailed analytics showing viewing patterns, geographic distribution, and engagement metrics. David's operation was clearly successful in reaching international audiences. 1 month ago, everything changed when I discovered what these broadcasts actually were. While reviewing archived footage for compliance documentation, I noticed that one of the computer monitors visible in the CCTV feed was displaying a dark web interface rather than the normal streaming platform David had described. The interface showed the same warehouse space I'd been monitoring, but it was labeled as a red room with viewer count displays and what appeared to be payment processing systems. The training sessions I'd been documenting weren't educational content. They were live torture and murder broadcasts being streamed to paying audiences on the dark web. The participants I'd watched weren't willing trainers demonstrating safety procedures. They were victims being murdered while thousands of people paid to watch. My detailed compliance documentation had been creating evidence of systematic killing for entertainment, and I'd been unknowingly facilitating the operation by providing security oversight. I realized that Industrial Solutions had never been an import-export company. The entire operation was designed to create a legitimate front for dark web red room broadcasting, using my security monitoring to ensure their activities remained undetected, while documenting everything for their own operational purposes. David's emphasis on enhanced security wasn't about protecting valuable equipment. It was about maintaining operational security for systematic murder. The professional CCTV coverage I'd been trained to monitor was partly for his own security, but also to create detailed archives of their broadcasts for premium subscribers. My compliance documentation hadn't been administrative record keeping. It had been creating detailed logs of murder events, participant information, and broadcast analytics that helped David's operation optimize their content for dark web audiences. I'd been an unwitting administrator for a systematic killing operation. When I confronted David about what I'd discovered, he calmly explained that I was already too deeply involved to simply walk away. Months of detailed documentation had created evidence trails that would suggest I was a willing participant, rather than an unknowing observer. My security reports contained information that could only have been gathered through knowing cooperation. David also revealed that my own activities had been under surveillance during this entire period. Security cameras monitoring the security office meant that my reactions to various broadcasts had been documented, showing my gradual normalization of increasingly disturbing content. This footage could be edited to suggest willing participation, rather than unknowing observation. I managed to escape and contact the police, but the investigation has revealed the complexity of prosecuting dark web crimes. The broadcasts were accessed through encrypted networks that make traditional evidence gathering extremely difficult. Most of the direct evidence exists in digital formats that require specialized technical knowledge to authenticate. More problematically, my own involvement creates complications for the prosecution. Months of detailed documentation and security monitoring could be characterized by defense lawyers as evidence of willing participation. My gradual acceptance of increasingly unusual activities could be presented as knowing cooperation rather than professional obligation. The police have moved me to protective custody while they investigate, but they've explained that dark web red room cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute successfully. The technology provides multiple layers of anonymity for operators and viewers, while the evidence often relies on witnesses whose own involvement can be questioned. David's operation has apparently shut down and relocated since my escape, but the police believe it's part of a larger network that operates multiple facilities across the country. Industrial Solutions was just one node in a system that uses legitimate business fronts to hide systematic murder broadcasting. The most disturbing aspect is learning how many people were involved in David's network without understanding what they were facilitating. Delivery drivers, equipment suppliers, cleaning services, and utility workers, all unknowingly supporting an operation that broadcast murder to international audiences. My case has become a test for how effectively law enforcement can prosecute dark web crimes using traditional legal frameworks. The police are trying to build a case that doesn't rely too heavily on my testimony, given the complications created by my unwitting involvement in documenting the operation. I've spent weeks in debriefing sessions, helping investigators understand how David's operation functioned and identifying other potential facilities that might be using similar business models. The scale of the network they've uncovered is far larger than anyone initially suspected. The investigation has revealed that Industrial Solutions was generating substantial revenue through their dark web broadcasts, with thousands of subscribers paying premium rates for access to live murder content. The professional quality and systematic operation made their broadcast particularly valuable to audiences seeking authentic material. I keep thinking about all the victims I watched die through those CCTV feeds, not understanding what I was really observing. People who were murdered while I documented their final moments for compliance reports that helped optimize their killer's broadcasting operation. The police have assured me that my cooperation is essential for prosecuting David's network, but they've also explained that the legal process could take years and that successful convictions are far from guaranteed. Dark web crimes exist in legal grey areas that traditional prosecution methods struggle to address effectively. I'm writing this from a safe house somewhere in Wales, where I'll remain until the investigation concludes and the trial process begins. The police believe David's network is still active and that my testimony poses a significant threat to their continued operations. Tomorrow, I'm supposed to meet with prosecutors who will determine whether my evidence is sufficient to build a case against David's network. But they've warned me that the legal challenges are substantial and that my own involvement creates complications that defense lawyers will certainly exploit. The most terrifying realization is that David's operation was just one of many similar networks operating across the country. The business park model provides perfect cover for dark web red rooms, using legitimate commercial spaces to hide systematic murder broadcasting, while unknowing security guards document everything. How many other security guards might be unknowingly monitoring murder broadcasts? How many business parks might house similar operations? How many people might be facilitating systematic killing without understanding what they're really observing? The dark web has made it possible for these operations to exist anywhere, hidden behind legitimate business fronts, broadcasting authentic murder to paying audiences while ordinary people unknowingly facilitate their activities. The technology makes it easy to hide, to pay anonymously, to consume murder as entertainment. I never thought security work could lead to becoming a witness to systematic murder. I thought the biggest risks were dealing with break-ins or equipment failures. I never imagined that monitoring CCTV feeds could make me complicit in facilitating dark web red room operations. The irony would be amusing if it weren't so horrifying. I spent months watching people die while thinking I was just doing my job, creating detailed documentation that helped optimize their murders for entertainment value. Tomorrow's meeting will determine whether my testimony can help prosecute David's network or whether the legal complications make a successful case impossible. Either way, I know I'll never be able to work security again. The guard becomes the witness to systematic murder, and there's no way to unsee what I've documented. And somewhere out there, David's network is probably setting up new operations, recruiting new security guards who don't know they're about to become unwitting administrators for the next generation of dark web entertainment. So this is going to sound like nothing for a while. I want you to know that up front, it's going to sound like a fairly ordinary account of a fairly ordinary woman living a fairly ordinary life in the north of England. And you're going to wonder where the horror is, and then you're going to find it. And when you do, I want you to remember that you thought it was nothing. That's the point. That's always been the point. My name is Rachel. I'm 32. I live in a mid-terrace in Harrogate that I bought with my ex-boyfriend 3 years ago and kept after we split, because I could just about cover the mortgage on my salary, and because the alternative was moving back to my mum's in Ripon, and I love her, but I couldn't do it. The house is on a quiet road about 15 minutes from the town centre. 2 bedrooms, a small garden. I've been meaning to do something with since the day I moved in, and haven't. It suits me. It's mine in a way that nothing had been mine before, not completely, and I'm attached to it in a slightly embarrassing way that I've stopped apologizing for. I work in marketing for a company that makes industrial filtration systems, which is exactly as interesting as it sounds. I write copy about products I will never fully understand for clients who need to feel confident in things they've already decided to buy. It pays well enough, it's mostly remote, and it allows me the kind of quiet, structured working day that suits my temperament. I like routine, always have. My ex said I was boring, which was partly true and partly just a thing people say when they've stopped finding you interesting and want the fault to live somewhere other than in themselves. My 2 closest friends are Becca, who I've known since university and who lives in Leeds, and my colleague Jess, who I see less often now we both work from home, but who I speak to most days. I have other friends, in the looser sense, people I see for birthday dinners and occasional Sunday pub lunches, and whose company I enjoy without feeling essential to. I go to a yoga class on Tuesday evenings. I run along the Stray on Saturday mornings when the weather allows. I read a lot of crime fiction and feel slightly guilty about not reading more literary novels, and never quite get around to rectifying this. I am, by any reasonable measure, a contented and well-adjusted person living a full and unremarkable life. I need you to have all of that in your head before I tell you anything else. The fullness of it, the ordinariness. Because what happened didn't happen to someone isolated or vulnerable, or at a low point. It happened to me, in my house, in my ordinary life, on an otherwise normal Tuesday in February. And the fact that it could happen in those conditions is the thing that has stayed with me longer than anything else. It started with a link. Becca sent it to me on a Wednesday evening in January, in a WhatsApp message that said, "Only have you seen this," followed by a string of laughing emojis. The link was to a Reddit thread, one of those compilation posts where people share strange or unsettling things they've found online. I read it with half my attention while the television was on, the way you consume most things on your phone after 9 in the evening. It was mildly interesting. A few entries were genuinely odd. I replied to Becca with a screenshot of the one I'd found funniest. We exchanged a few more messages, and I put my phone down and went to bed. What I didn't do in that first session was reach the bottom of the thread. I went back to it the following evening because I was procrastinating on a piece of copy that wasn't coming together, and my brain needed something low stakes to do for 20 minutes. I read further this time, past the entries I'd seen the night before, into the later comments where the contributions became progressively more obscure. Most of it was still in the register of internet curiosity. Strange websites, odd subcultures, The kinds of digital corners that exist for no apparent reason, but are ultimately harmless. And then, about 2/3 down, someone had posted a link with a description that was vague enough to be intriguing and specific enough to be unsettling. The description said only that it was a forum, that it was invitation only, that someone had got hold of an invite, and what they'd found inside was unlike anything they'd described before. I clicked it because I was procrastinating, and because the description was well written, and because I am, despite everything, curious by nature. The link resolved to what appeared to be a standard-looking forum interface. Muted colors, plain text. The kind of design that hasn't been updated in years and doesn't need to be, because function is the point, rather than appearance. There was a registration page. I didn't register. I read what was visible without logging in, which was limited. A few thread titles, some category headings, nothing that revealed much about the content. The thread titles were odd, not explicit, not immediately alarming, but odd in the way that certain things are odd when the language is slightly off, when the register doesn't quite match what the words appear to be saying. I closed the tab and finished the copy and went to bed. The yoga class that Tuesday was good. The instructor had put together a sequence that was genuinely difficult in the right places, and I drove home afterwards with that particular physical contentment that comes from having used your body properly, pleasantly tired, thinking about nothing more significant than what I was going to eat when I got in. The road was quiet, the house was warm. I made pasta and watched something on television and read for an hour before bed. I slept well. I always sleep well. The next day was Wednesday, and I had a call with a client in the morning that went better than expected. And Jess and I had a long debrief about it over a video call that made us both laugh. And in the afternoon, I finished a piece of work I'd been chipping away at for a week and felt the clean satisfaction of completion. I ran a bath. I rang my mum. I was in bed by 10 and asleep before 11. Thursday, I went back to the forum. I'm not going to pretend I don't know why. The thread titles had stayed with me in the way that certain things stay when your brain hasn't finished with them, turning them over at the edges of other thoughts. I told myself I was going back to look properly, to satisfy the curiosity and move on, which is what you tell yourself in these situations. I registered with an email address I use for mailing lists and nothing important. Chose a username that had no connection to anything real about me and got in. The forum had perhaps 30 active threads across several categories. Most of the categories were vague. Discussion, resources, recommendations, which could have meant anything and turned out to mean very specific things once you read into them. I spent about an hour reading without contributing, moving through threads in the way you move through a new environment, getting a sense of the geography before committing to any particular direction. The community had its own language, abbreviations, references, shorthand that assumed shared knowledge, the kind of internal vocabulary that develops in any closed group over time. I didn't understand all of it on that first session. I understood enough to know that what the community was organized around was the documentation and discussion of real-world harm, not hypothetical harm, not fiction. Events that had happened or were happening, recorded and shared and discussed with the analytical interest of people who had developed a framework for this that placed it outside the register of ordinary moral consideration. I closed the laptop at about 11 and sat on the sofa for a while. Then I reopened it and kept reading. The Saturday run was good, cold but dry, the Stray empty enough at 8 in the morning that I had long stretches of it to myself, the trees bare against a pale sky, my breath visible, my mind clearing in the way it clears with sustained physical effort. I ran further than usual, closer to 8 miles than my standard 5, and came home feeling scraped clean, which was what I needed. Becca came for lunch on the Sunday. We sat in the kitchen with the heating up and talked for 4 hours about everything and nothing. Her job, her complicated situation with a man she'd been seeing, my ex, whether I was going to do anything with the garden this year. It was the kind of afternoon that reminds you why certain friendships matter. The ease of being known, the absence of performance. She left at 5, and I waved her off from the doorstep and felt genuinely, straightforwardly happy. That evening, I went back to the forum and found a thread that had been posted while Becca and I were having lunch. The thread was in the discussion category. It was structured around a specific event, something that had happened, the poster said, within the past week in the north of England. The details were partial and deliberately vague in places, but the location references were specific enough to be identifiable if you knew the area. I knew the area. I had grown up 20 minutes from the place being described. The event itself, and I am going to be plain about this without being gratuitous, because the details are necessary, and because dressing them up would be its own kind of dishonesty, involved a woman, alone, in her home. What had happened to her was described in the thread with the same analytical, slightly detached register I'd been reading for 2 weeks, clinical in its precision, interested in the methodology rather than the person. There were photographs. I won't describe them except to say that the photographs were real, and the woman in them had not consented to any of what they showed, and what had been done to her was thorough and deliberate, and had clearly taken a long time. The thread had 27 replies. The replies were not expressions of horror. They were expressions of interest, questions about specifics, requests for additional material. One reply, posted that afternoon while Becca and I were talking about the garden, asked whether there was footage as well as photographs, and whether it could be shared to a specific subforum I hadn't found yet. I closed the laptop. I sat in the kitchen where 4 hours earlier I'd been happy in an uncomplicated way that now felt very far away. And I thought about the woman in the photographs, and I thought about the north of England, and I thought about the 20 minutes between where I was sitting and where the thread said it had happened. And then I thought about the last 2 weeks, the registration with the throwaway email, the username with no connection to anything real. I thought about whether that was actually true, whether the account was as disconnected from me as I'd assumed when I created it, whether I actually knew enough about how these things work to be confident of that. I opened the laptop again, not to read, but to think through what I'd done and what it meant, and whether I had, in 2 weeks of curious and increasingly absorbed browsing, left any trail between the throwaway account and the person sitting in a terrace in Harrogate who knew exactly how far 20 minutes was from where that woman had been photographed. I thought about the thread titles I'd found odd on that first evening, the register that was slightly off. I understood now what the register was. I understood that I had been reading for 2 weeks the ongoing documentation of real harm committed against real people. And I'd kept going back, and the community I had been reading had systems in place for the vetting of new members that I hadn't found yet and didn't fully understand. And I did not know what information they had gathered about me in the process of allowing me access. I rang the police at 9:10. I was on hold for a while, and then I spoke to someone and explained what I'd found, what the thread contained, the location references, the photographs, the date. They took it seriously. I gave them everything I could, the URL, the thread title, my account details, all of it. The woman in the photographs was identified. She was alive. which I learned 3 weeks later from a follow-up call I'd asked for, and which the liaison officer said was unusual to share, but that she felt, in this case, was warranted. She had been found. She was receiving care. The investigation was ongoing. I deleted the throwaway email account the same night I made the call. I don't know if that was the right decision, or whether it destroyed something that might have been useful. I made it because I needed to do something concrete, and that was the thing available to me. It's been 8 months. The yoga class is still on Tuesdays. I still run the Stray on Saturday mornings when the weather allows. The garden is still unfinished, and I've accepted that I'm probably not a garden person, and that's fine. Becca still comes for lunch occasionally, and we still sit in the kitchen for 4 hours talking about everything and nothing, and those afternoons are still the thing they always were. What's different is smaller and harder to name. It's a quality of attention I carry into ordinary things now that wasn't there before. A knowledge about what exists, what is documented, what is discussed in certain places with a casualness that I still find, 8 months later, almost impossible to fully absorb. I knew in the abstract that terrible things happened and that some people organized their lives around the commission or consumption of those things. Knowing it in the abstract is entirely different from having spent 2 weeks reading the specific language of those people, the particular way their interest presents itself on a page, the ordinary sounding sentences in which extraordinary harm is discussed. The woman in the photographs is alive. I repeat that to myself sometimes when the knowledge gets heaviest. She's alive and receiving care, and the investigation is ongoing. And I made the call at 9:10 on a Sunday evening 8 months ago, and those facts are real, and they matter. What I can't fully resolve, and I've stopped trying, mostly, is the 2 weeks before the call. The evenings I went back, the hour on the Thursday, the session after Becca left, the accumulation of sessions between the first link and the Sunday night when everything became undeniable and I picked up the phone. I wasn't looking for harm. I wasn't seeking out content of that kind. I was curious, and then I was absorbed, and then I was in something I hadn't seen the edges of until I was already well inside it. That's the part that stays. Not the horror of what I found, though that stays too, but the ease of the path in. How unremarkable each individual step was. How little any single evening felt like a decision. How thoroughly ordinary my life remained on either side of those sessions. The yoga, the run, the client calls, Becca in the kitchen, my mum on the phone, while I was reading things that had no business existing in the same world as any of that. The house is still mine. The road is still quiet. I still sleep well mostly. I just know things now that I didn't know in January, and some of them I'd give a great deal to unknow. And the option to do that has never been available and never will be. That's the deal, I suppose. That's what curiosity costs you when it takes you somewhere you weren't equipped to go. Six months ago, I considered myself pretty tech-savvy. I've built my own computers since I was 15, worked in IT for a few years before switching to graphic design, and thought I knew the difference between the regular web and the darker corners of the internet. Turns out I had no idea how quickly you can stumble into something terrible when you're not paying attention. I'm 32, recently divorced, and was going through that classic post-breakup phase where loneliness hits hardest late at night. My ex and I had been together since university, nearly 10 years, before she decided we'd grown in different directions and moved out last autumn. After the split, I threw myself into freelance design work during the day, but the evenings stretched endlessly in my too-quiet flat in Bristol. I'd never really dated as an adult, having met my ex in a philosophy seminar when I was 21, and the whole online dating scene felt overwhelming. One Friday night in February, after a couple of beers and a particularly depressing attempt at cooking for one, I found myself browsing dating sites. Not the mainstream apps everyone uses, but increasingly obscure ones I discovered through Reddit threads and tech forums. I told myself I was just researching the user experience as a designer, but really, I was lonely and curious about how people connected online now. Around 1 a.m., after falling down a rabbit hole of increasingly dubious dating platforms, I clicked a link that promised unfiltered video connections with no corporate censorship. The site looked professionally designed but had an edgy aesthetic, dark background, red accents, minimalist interface. It required no sign-up, just an agreement to terms of service I admittedly didn't read, and access to my webcam, which I allowed without much thought. In my slightly buzzed state, the lack of registration seemed convenient rather than suspicious. The site's landing page displayed thumbnails of what appeared to be webcam feeds, mostly women in dimly lit bedrooms, some wearing lingerie, others in casual clothes. It resembled any number of cam sites that exist in that grey area between dating and adult content. I remember thinking it was probably one of those pay-to-chat services and was about to close the tab when a notification popped up. User Diamond Girl 92 has invited you to a private room. The thumbnail showed a woman with dark hair, face partially obscured by shadows, but smiling in what looked like a bedroom. Something about the spontaneous invitation appealed to my ego. The idea that someone had chosen to connect with me specifically. I clicked accept without hesitation. The video feed that opened was grainy and underlit, showing a woman sitting on what appeared to be a bed with dark sheets. The room behind her was sparsely decorated, just some plain walls and what looked like a closed door. She waved at the camera and typed something in a chat box that appeared beside the video. "Hi there, thanks for joining. Can you hear me?" I typed back that I could, and she explained her microphone was broken, so she'd communicate by text, while I could use my microphone if I wanted. This seemed reasonable enough. Plenty of legitimate users have technical issues. She asked basic getting-to-know-you questions. My name, I gave a fake one. Where I was from, I just said UK. What I did for work. I answered vaguely, still maintaining that cautious online anonymity, but feeling increasingly comfortable as the conversation progressed. After about 15 minutes of this seemingly innocent chat, her messages took a flirtatious turn. She suggested we could have some fun and asked if I'd like to see more of her. Again, this seemed like the typical progression on sites like this, usually leading to requests for payment or registration. I was curious how the scam would play out, so I went along with it, typing that I was interested. What happened next was the first real warning sign, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. Instead of the expected request for payment, she asked me to verify I wasn't a cop or scammer by clicking a verification link. The link opened what appeared to be a standard verification page asking for my IP to be checked against a database of known law enforcement IPs. This should have immediately set off alarm bells. No legitimate site would need such verification, but my judgment was impaired by alcohol and the late hour. I clicked the link without thinking, and a loading bar appeared, supposedly scanning my connection. After a moment, a green checkmark appeared, with verification successful, and I was returned to the chat. Looking back, I realized this was almost certainly installing some kind of tracking software or malware on my system, though I didn't know it then. The woman seemed pleased with the verification and began to undress slowly. The video quality remained poor, which she apologized for via text, explaining she had bandwidth issues. As she removed her top, I noticed something odd, what looked like faint marks or bruises on her shoulders and arms. I typed asking if she was okay, and she quickly responded that she had sensitive skin and bruised easily. Something felt off about the interaction, but I couldn't quite place what. The video occasionally stuttered or froze, and sometimes her movements didn't quite sync with her responses in the chat. I began to wonder if I was watching pre-recorded footage being manipulated by whoever was typing to me. About 30 minutes into the date, the tone shifted dramatically. The woman looked over her shoulder suddenly, as if hearing something off camera. Her expression changed from flirtatious to what appeared to be genuine fear. The chat box pinged with a new message. Special request show about to begin. Premium viewers are bidding. Current high bid, 0.35 Bitcoin. I was confused, wondering if this was part of some roleplay scenario. The camera angle shifted abruptly, widening to show more of the room. What I had assumed was a bedroom now looked more institutional. The bed, more like an examination table. The walls bare concrete rather than painted. A door opened in the background, and a figure in dark clothing entered the frame. With sickening clarity, I realized what I had stumbled into. This wasn't a dating site or even a standard cam site. It was what's known in dark web terminology as a red room, where viewers pay to watch actual harm being inflicted on non-consenting individuals. The verification I had completed wasn't checking if I was law enforcement. It was validating my connection to a dark web stream, likely through a series of proxies I hadn't noticed. I frantically tried to close the browser, but it wouldn't respond. New messages appeared in rapid succession in the chat box. Usernames I didn't recognize, placing bids alongside horrific requests. The woman on screen was now clearly terrified, no longer maintaining any pretense of a consensual performance. When I tried to force quit the browser, a new window popped up with text that chilled me to the bone. Your IP has been logged. Your webcam is active. Disconnection will be interpreted as hostile intent. Payment of 2.0 Bitcoin required for secure disconnection. I realized with horror that my own webcam light was on, had been this entire time, and whoever was running this stream could see me, had been watching me watch them. The verification process had likely given them access to my system, possibly recording everything. In a panic, I physically unplugged my laptop from the wall, not even bothering with a proper shutdown. I sat in my dark living room, heart pounding, wondering if what I'd seen was really happening, if someone was really being hurt while people watched and paid for the privilege, if I had just witnessed the beginning of something unspeakable. After a few minutes of absolute terror, I plugged the laptop back in and booted up in safe mode, running every security and antivirus program I had. They detected multiple intrusions, keyloggers, remote access tools, webcam hijacking software. I wiped the hard drive completely and reinstalled the operating system, then spent the rest of the night researching what had happened, using an old tablet connected to my neighbor's Wi-Fi rather than my own network. What I discovered was truly terrifying. The site I had accessed was likely a front end for a dark web operation, designed to appear as a normal dating site on the surface web, but actually serving as a gateway to illegal live streams. The verification process had routed my connection through Tor nodes without my knowledge, connecting me to a hidden service while simultaneously compromising my system security. I spent the next week in a state of constant anxiety, jumping at every notification on my phone, every knock at the door. I changed all my passwords, got a new IP address, even considered moving flats. I debated going to the police but feared implicating myself in something I'd accidentally accessed. What if they didn't believe I had stumbled into it unknowingly? What if the malware had downloaded illegal content to my now wiped hard drive? 3 weeks after the incident, I received an email to an account connected to my real name, an account I hadn't used during the interaction on the site. The message contained only a still image from my webcam showing my face, as I watched the stream, my expression changing from interest to horror as I realized what was happening. Below the image was a Bitcoin wallet address and the words, "For your privacy." I never paid, never responded. Instead, I created new email accounts, changed my phone number, deleted all social media, and started using advanced security measures like VPNs and Tails OS for all my browsing. I even grew a beard and changed my hairstyle, irrationally afraid that my image might be circulating in places I couldn't access or control. It's been 6 months now. Sometimes I convince myself it wasn't real, that it was an elaborate scam designed to extort money through fear rather than an actual crime being committed. But late at night, when I can't sleep, I remember the woman's expression changing from performed seduction to genuine terror, and I know what I saw was real. The most disturbing part isn't the extortion attempt or even the violation of my privacy. It's the knowledge that these hidden corners of the internet exist where people pay to watch actual suffering, and how terrifyingly easy it was for me, a relatively knowledgeable internet user, to stumble into one without even realizing where I was. The line between the everyday internet and its darkest depths is thinner than most people realize, and sometimes all it takes is a single careless click to cross it. I still use dating apps now, carefully vetted mainstream ones only. But every time I see a webcam icon or a verification request, my heart races, and I remember that night. And sometimes, when my webcam light illuminates unexpectedly during a system update or video call, I can't help but cover it immediately, wondering who might be watching from the other side. Okay, so this might just be me, but have you ever had a moment when your phone screen shows you something disturbing and you immediately check over your shoulder to make sure no one can see what you're looking at, even when you're completely alone? 4 months ago, I experienced something on the dark web that I've been unable to shake from my mind. So here goes. It started on an entirely ordinary Tuesday evening. I just finished a late dinner, microwave lasagna, nothing special, and was sitting on the toilet, mindlessly scrolling through my phone as one does. I'd been fascinated with the dark web for about a year by that point. Not because I wanted anything illegal, mind you. I've always been the curious type, ever since I was a kid taking apart my toys to see how they worked. Studied computer science at university. Worked in IT for 8 years now. I suppose that's why I first downloaded Tor. Professional curiosity, I told myself. A bit of a lie, that. I'd browse the dark web occasionally when bored, usually after a few drinks, mostly just looking at marketplaces selling counterfeit goods or dodgy pharmaceuticals. Nothing too sinister, though there was always that thrill of knowing I was somewhere I perhaps shouldn't be, like a digital urban explorer. That night, I'd had a couple of whiskeys after a particularly stressful day at work. My boss had been on my case about some server issues that weren't even my department. The bathroom was the only place my flatmate wouldn't disturb me. So there I sat, trousers around my ankles, scrolling through forums I had no business visiting. I'd found my way onto a forum I hadn't seen before. Black background, red text, very 90s web design. The site claimed to be for practical solutions to complex problems. Vague enough to sound legitimate at first glance. I was scrolling through thread titles, mostly stuff about bypassing security systems or creating untraceable identities, when I saw a post titled DIY Silence Methods. My finger hovered over it for a moment. The title was just ambiguous enough that it could have been about soundproofing a room or creating white noise to help with sleep, but something in my gut told me it wasn't. Still, Curiosity got the better of me. It always does, doesn't it? I tapped the thread. The page loaded slowly. Tor's never been known for its speed. And what appeared made me physically recoil. The thread contained meticulously detailed guides for creating homemade torture devices. Not historical information or theoretical concepts, but step-by-step instructions with diagrams showing how to build tools specifically designed to cause pain, without leaving visible marks. Tools designed to extract information, while keeping the victim conscious. Tools designed for silence. I remember my bathroom suddenly felt very cold. The radiator had been on full blast. My flatmate always complained about my excessive heating bills. But I felt goosebumps forming on my arms. What disturbed me most wasn't just the content itself, but the clinical, almost academic tone, as if the author was explaining how to assemble IKEA furniture, not instruments of suffering. And worse still were the comments beneath each design, users suggesting improvements or sharing their field test results. I should have closed the app immediately, should have deleted Tor, reset my phone, and forgotten the whole thing. Instead, like a witness to a car crash, I couldn't look away. I scrolled further, reading through post after post. People were casually discussing the merits of different techniques, like they were reviewing kitchen appliances. This method is too messy for apartment use. This one tends to cause unconsciousness too quickly. I found adding this modification extends the process by several hours. My stomach churned. The microwave lasagna threatened to make a reappearance. Yet I kept scrolling, telling myself I was just documenting the depravity, as if I were some sort of digital anthropologist studying the darkest corners of humanity. What a load of rubbish. I was rubbernecking at human suffering. That's when I noticed the view counter at the bottom of the thread. Only 3 people were currently viewing this horrendous content. The forum administrator, someone with the rank field expert, and me. 3 people in a hidden corner of the internet that should require specific knowledge even to find. I suddenly felt very exposed, like I'd wandered into a private meeting I wasn't invited to. As I was about to close the app, a notification appeared at the top of my screen. A private message. The username matched the field expert, currently viewing the thread. My thumb hovered over the notification. Every instinct told me not to open it. But again, that damn curiosity. I tapped it. First time browsing our resources. I notice you've been on this page for 16 minutes, looking for something specific. I offer practical demonstrations for serious clients. My blood ran cold. 16 minutes. Had I really been staring at this horror show for that long? And what did they mean by practical demonstrations? I didn't respond, immediately closing the app and shutting off my phone entirely. I sat there in the bathroom, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I was. Trousers around my ankles, the faint drip of the leaky tap, the only sound breaking the silence. I finally gathered myself, washed my hands thoroughly, as if I could somehow clean away what I'd seen, and went to bed. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept thinking about how the person had known exactly how long I'd been viewing the thread. Was there some tracker embedded in the page? Had I compromised my anonymity somehow? I told myself I was being paranoid. The dark web is supposed to be anonymous. That's the whole point. This was probably just a scammer trying to frighten naive browsers into paying for services that didn't exist. The next morning, I convinced myself it was nothing to worry about. Just another internet weirdo trying to seem more dangerous than they actually were. I went to work, had a relatively normal day, and had almost put the incident out of my mind by the time I got home. Almost. That evening, I received an email to my personal account, not my work email or any address I'd ever used with Tor. The subject line, regarding your interest in silence methods. The body contained only an attachment, a PDF. I scanned it with 3 different antivirus programs before opening it. It wasn't malware, it was worse. The PDF contained a customized silence method, tailored specifically for someone matching my exact physical description. Height, weight, even the small scar on my left wrist from a childhood accident. The document detailed how my apartment layout, which it described with disturbing accuracy, would provide optimal acoustics for the procedure. It mentioned how my neighbor's hearing impairment would be advantageous. It specified which of my kitchen implements would be most effective. I felt the world tilt sideways. How could they possibly know these things about me? I'd been so careful with my identity online. I'd used Tor correctly. I'd never entered personal information. My hands shook as I deleted the email, then emptied my trash folder, as if that would somehow protect me. I spent that night at a friend's house, making up some story about a water leak in my flat. I didn't sleep. Couldn't even close my eyes without seeing those diagrams, now with my face superimposed on the victim. The next day, I contacted my internet provider, changed all my passwords, and factory reset my phone. I convinced myself that someone had hacked my device, that it was all just an elaborate scam to frighten me. I almost believed it too. 3 days later, I came home from work to find my apartment door unlocked. Nothing was missing. Nothing was visibly disturbed. But on my kitchen table sat a small metal object I'd never seen before. It matched exactly one of the components shown in the torture device diagrams, a custom thumb screw with peculiar modifications. Beside it was a handwritten note. For your consideration, field testing appointment scheduled for Friday. I didn't pack. I didn't call the police. What would I even say? That I'd been browsing torture methods on the dark web and now someone wanted to demonstrate them on me. I grabbed my passport, wallet, and the clothes on my back. I drove straight to my parents' house in Scotland, 6 hours away, checking my rearview mirror the entire journey. I stayed there for 2 weeks, told them I was on holiday. When I finally returned to London, I moved to a new flat in a different area. I changed my phone number, email addresses, even deleted all my social media. I never went back on the dark web, never wanted to. It's been 4 months now, no more strange emails, no more unlocked doors or mysterious objects. I should feel safe, but I don't. Because here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. Whoever found me didn't do it through some dark web tracking. They found me in the real world. They had physical access to my home, which means they weren't just some distant internet bogeyman. They were close, possibly someone I know, possibly someone I still interact with every day. Sometimes, when I'm sitting on the toilet, scrolling through perfectly innocent websites on my new phone, I'll remember those diagrams. I'll remember how casually people discuss methods of causing unimaginable pain. And I'll wonder if the person who sent me that PDF is watching me right now, silently testing my new security, waiting for the perfect moment to reschedule our field testing appointment. Because that's the thing about the dark web. It's not just some abstract digital realm separate from our everyday lives. The people there are real. They live among us. They could be anyone. The friendly IT guy at your office. The quiet neighbor who always nods hello. And sometimes, when you glimpse their other life, they notice you noticing them. And they don't like it one bit. I started working from home last January, The transition wasn't difficult. My job as a data analyst for a health insurance company translated well to remote work. Just me, my laptop, and endless spreadsheets tracking claim patterns and cost projections. The company sent us home with monitors, docking stations, and even ergonomic chairs. They wanted to make sure our productivity wouldn't suffer during the isolation. My apartment wasn't ideal for a home office. One bedroom, thin walls, and neighbors who seemed determined to renovate during business hours. I converted half my living room into a workspace, setting up near the window for natural light. The arrangement worked well enough for the first few months. My internet connection was reliable, my work routine established, my performance reviews positive. In April, I started having connection issues. Video calls would freeze, downloads would stall. Websites that had loaded instantly now took ages to appear. At first, I blamed my service provider. They were notorious for throttling speeds during peak hours. But after several technician visits and modem replacements, the problems persisted. Strangely, the issues seemed most pronounced between midnight and 4 a.m., when I wasn't even using the internet. I started monitoring my network traffic using software recommended by our IT department. The data showed massive bandwidth consumption during those early morning hours, despite all my devices supposedly being in sleep mode. Something was using my connection and using it heavily. My first thought was a neighbor had somehow accessed my network. I changed my Wi-Fi password, enabled additional security features, and installed a VPN. The mysterious usage continued. Next, I suspected malware. Perhaps my laptop had been compromised and was part of some botnet. I ran every scanning tool available, finding nothing unusual. The IT team remotely inspected my work laptop and pronounced it clean. The mystery bothered me enough that I began staying up late, watching the network monitor in real time, trying to identify which device was responsible. My sleep suffered. Dark circles formed under my eyes. My work performance began to decline. Colleagues commented on my appearance during video calls. I started keeping the camera off. One night in May, around 1 a.m., I caught it happening. The network monitor showed active data transfer, nearly maxing out my bandwidth. The source was a device listed only as media server, something I didn't recognize and certainly hadn't set up. I immediately logged into my router's admin panel to block the device, but when I refreshed the connected devices list, media server had disappeared. The next day, I contacted my building's management company about the internet issues. The maintenance supervisor suggested I might be picking up interference from other apartments and recommended positioning my router away from shared walls. When I mentioned the mysterious device, he seemed uninterested, attributing it to a neighbor's smart TV or gaming system, briefly connecting to the wrong network. That explanation didn't satisfy me. I ordered a new router with advanced security features, setting it up to log all connection attempts and data usage by device. That night, I stayed up again, watching the logs in real time. At precisely 1:17 a.m., media server appeared again, beginning its huge data transfers. This time, I managed to capture its MAC address before it disappeared, a unique identifier that should help track down the physical device. The next morning, I contacted a friend who works in cybersecurity. He couldn't identify the manufacturer from the MAC address. It seemed to be using a randomized identifier that changed with each connection. This was sophisticated behavior, not typical of consumer electronics accidentally connecting to the wrong network. When I shared the timing pattern and bandwidth usage, he grew concerned. The behavior matched what he called data mules, compromised networks used to transmit large encrypted files during low traffic hours. My friend warned me that my network might be being used for transferring illegal content, anything from stolen financial data to more disturbing materials. He recommended I contact my internet service provider and possibly law enforcement. The thought that my connection might be facilitating something illegal made me deeply uncomfortable. Before taking that step, I decided to gather more information. I set up additional monitoring software that could track not just the amount of data, but also attempt to identify the type of traffic and its destination. The results were puzzling. The data wasn't being sent to multiple destinations as would be expected with botnet activity. Instead, it was a sustained connection to a single endpoint, using encrypted protocols that masked the content. The destination IP address changed nightly, but always pointed to servers using Tor exit nodes, the infrastructure of the so-called dark web. My friend confirmed this was consistent with someone using my network as a relay for accessing hidden services, potentially to mask their own identity. The question remained, who was doing this and how had they gained access? I became obsessed with finding answers. I started logging every electronic device in my apartment, not just computers and phones, but the smart TV, digital thermostat, even the refrigerator with its internet connectivity feature. None matched the mysterious media server MAC address. I checked for hidden devices, looking behind furniture, inside vents, examining the electrical outlets for suspicious adapters. Nothing. In June, after 6 weeks of disrupted sleep and growing anxiety, I made a breakthrough. The mystery device only connected when I was home. On nights I stayed at a friend's place or worked late at a coffee shop. My network log showed no unusual activity. The implication was unsettling. Whatever was happening was somehow tied to my presence. That night, I conducted an experiment. I left all my devices powered on as usual, but shut off the bedroom and bathroom lights, creating the impression I had gone to sleep. Then I sat in darkness near my router, a network analyzer running silently on my laptop. At 1:14 a.m., I heard a soft electronic tone from somewhere in my apartment, almost imperceptible, like the sound a device makes when powering on. 3 minutes later, Media Server appeared on my network. I tracked the signal strength, moving my laptop around the apartment to find where it was strongest. The source appeared to be my bedroom. I searched methodically, under the bed, in the closet, behind the dresser. Nothing. Then I noticed my work laptop, closed and apparently asleep on the nightstand. According to my monitoring software, it wasn't the source. But when I opened it, the screen remained dark while the power indicator showed it was running. I forced a shutdown and restarted it. Everything seemed normal. The company's security software showed no unauthorized access, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the machine. I decided to work exclusively on my personal laptop for a few days, leaving the work device powered off and stored in a drawer. The mysterious bandwidth usage stopped immediately. 3 nights with no media server appearing on my network. On the 4th day, I received an email from IT asking why my work laptop hadn't connected to the company servers for scheduled updates. I explained I was having technical issues and was using my personal device temporarily. They insisted I reconnect the work laptop as soon as possible for security compliance. Reluctantly, I took the laptop from the drawer and powered it on. Everything appeared normal. Same login screen, same desktop configuration, same applications. But that night, Media Server reappeared on my network at exactly 1:17 a.m. I was now convinced the work laptop contained something it shouldn't. I contacted IT again, more explicitly describing my concerns. They seemed dismissive. suggesting I was misinterpreting normal corporate security measures that run in the background. When I pressed further, mentioning the dark web connections, their tone changed. They said they would send a replacement laptop immediately and asked me to return my current one directly to their security team rather than through the normal equipment channels. The replacement arrived the next day via courier. The security team requested I not power on the old laptop again and pack it in the provided shielded bag. Their sudden urgency only heightened my suspicion. That night, with the old laptop unplugged and sealed in the shielded bag, my network remained quiet. No unusual connections, no bandwidth spikes. In July, a month after returning the laptop, I received a call from someone identifying themselves as part of the company's external security audit team. They asked detailed questions about my work habits, when I typically logged in, how often I used the company VPN, whether I ever observed unusual behavior from the laptop. They seemed particularly interested in whether I used the machine during off hours or if it remained powered on overnight. I answered honestly, then asked why they were investigating. The auditor explained they were conducting routine security checks on all remote workers. The explanation seemed reasonable, but something in their tone felt rehearsed. A week later, I was called into a virtual meeting with HR and my department head. They explained that due to restructuring, my position was being eliminated. They offered a generous severance package in exchange for signing a confidentiality agreement covering not just company data, but also any observations about company equipment or security practices. The implication was clear. Take the money, stay quiet, move on. I signed the agreement. The severance would cover my expenses while I looked for new work. But I couldn't stop thinking about what had been happening. What had been on that laptop? What kind of data was being transmitted through my network in those early morning hours? My cybersecurity friend suggested a theory. The laptop had been compromised, not by an outside threat, but by someone inside the company. Perhaps someone in IT or security was using employee devices as relays for accessing dark web services, counting on the company's VPN and security software to mask their activities. The fact that the usage occurred only when I was home suggested the laptop might have been monitoring my presence, perhaps through the microphone detecting ambient noise or the webcam sensing light changes, to determine when it was safe to activate. In August, I found a new job with a different company. Remote work again, but this time I established strict boundaries. No equipment stays powered on after hours. Nothing connects to my home network without thorough vetting. I invested in a network firewall that logs and blocks suspicious activities. I should have felt secure again. I didn't. Last week, I received an anonymous email. The subject line contained only a timestamp, 1:17 a.m. The body was empty. I deleted it immediately and ran security scans on all my devices. Nothing unusual was detected. 3 days ago, while reviewing my new home security system footage, I noticed something strange. At exactly 1:17 a.m., the camera in my home office briefly lost connection, just for a few seconds, but long enough to create a gap in the recording. The system logs showed no errors, no power fluctuations, no explanation for the interruption. Yesterday, I received a package. No return address, no shipping label, no indication of how it had arrived at my door. Inside was a laptop, not a brand I recognized, with no manufacturer markings of any kind. Just a plain black case with a power button that emitted a soft blue glow. I haven't opened it, haven't connected it to power. It sits in my closet now, inside 3 layers of signal blocking material. I haven't told anyone about the package, haven't reported it to the police. Something tells me it wouldn't make a difference. Something tells me this isn't about me specifically. I'm just a node in a network, a convenient relay point for information traveling between unseen parties. Sometimes at night, I wake suddenly at 1:16 a.m., 1 minute before whatever this is activates. I lie in bed, listening to the silence of my apartment, waiting for that soft electronic tone I heard months ago. Sometimes I think I hear it, just at the edge of perception. Sometimes I convince myself it's just imagination. But the other night, I checked my network logs out of habit. At exactly 1:17 a.m. for precisely 3 minutes, an unknown device had connected to my network. The identifier was different this time. Not media server, but observer client. The data transfer was minimal, just a few kilobytes. Just enough to send a message. I'm still here. I'm still watching. I'm writing this now as a warning, though I'm not entirely sure what I'm warning against. Corporate espionage, government surveillance, organized criminal networks. The boundary between these possibilities seems increasingly blurred. All I know with certainty is that our digital lives are not as private as we imagine, our networks not as secure as we're led to believe. Something moves through the infrastructure we've built, using our connections, our devices, our homes as waypoints in a journey we can't see or understand. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, it pauses briefly at your address before continuing on its way.